In the winter of 1692, a Massachusetts Bay Colony minister recorded the confiscation of a single farm. The land was 300 acres of prime, cleared riverfront property. It was taken from a woman accused of witchcraft. This is not a theory. This is in the probate court records. And the people who lost everything, they weren't just the accused. It was their families, their children, their heirs. People who had spent generations turning wilderness into a home, watching it be signed away with a stroke of a pen. Tonight, we're going through the Salem Witch Trials, the story you think you know, the names you've never heard, and the property deeds that tell a completely different story. You know the basics. You learned them in school. It's one of those foundational American stories, a dark fairy tale from our colonial past. Salem Village, 1692. A group of young girls start having fits. They scream. They contort. They claim to be pinched and bitten by invisible forces. The local doctor, William Griggs, can find no physical cause. In a time when the world is still deeply mysterious, when the wilderness feels like it's pressing in on all sides, he gives the only diagnosis that makes sense to a Puritan mind: witchcraft. And so the hunt begins. The girls, led by the minister's daughter, Betty Paris, and her cousin Abigail Williams, start naming names. First, it's the outsiders. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean in the Paris household. Sarah Good, a poor, abrasive woman who goes door-to-door begging. Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who hadn't been to church in a while and had a legally questionable marriage. You can almost see the logic. The marginalized, the inconvenient, the strange. But here's the part they always skip over when they tell you this story in 5th grade. They never really explain why. Why then? Why there? Massachusetts had seen witchcraft accusations before, a handful here and there over the decades. They were dealt with, sometimes harshly, but they never exploded into a full-blown epidemic. So what was different about Salem Village in 1692? You have to understand the place. It wasn't just a quaint little town. Salem was actually 2 places. There was Salem Town, a prosperous, growing port on the coast. Merchants, trade, a certain worldliness. And then a few miles inland there was Salem Village, a farming community, isolated, conservative. The people of the village were, legally and religiously, still part of Salem Town. They had to travel to the town for church, for court, to pay taxes. They resented it, deeply. The village was split right down the middle. On one side, you had families who wanted to break away, to become their own independent parish with their own minister. They were tired of the long, dangerous trek to the town church, tired of being ruled by wealthy merchants who didn't understand their farming lives. On the other side, you had families who were tied to Salem Town, through business, through family, through ambition. They liked the connection. They benefited from it. And right in the middle of this bitter, years-long feud was the parsonage, the home of the minister, Samuel Paris. He was the village's first ordained minister, hired specifically by the separatist faction. His salary and firewood were supposed to be provided by the villagers, but the pro-town faction often refused to pay. Paris and his family lived in a state of constant, humiliating insecurity. The man was not popular. He was rigid, paranoid, and deeply invested in proving his own importance to the community that was stiffing him on his pay. Now, picture his household in that cold, lean winter of 1691-92. His daughter, Betty, is 9. His niece, Abigail, is 11. They're bored. The world is frozen outside. They're stuck in a house with a tense, unhappy father and Tituba, an enslaved woman who, according to later accounts, would tell them stories from her past. Stories that were not from the Bible. Stories about magic and fortune-telling and other worlds. The story goes that the girls, maybe for fun, maybe out of curiosity, asked Tituba to help them tell their fortunes. Who would they marry? What would their futures hold? A classic sleepover game, right? But in Puritan New England, this wasn't a game. This was dabbling with the occult. It was a serious sin. And when Betty Paris started behaving strangely, hiding under furniture, contorting her body, complaining of bites and pinches, the fear in that house must have been electric. Samuel Paris had enemies. What if his own household was corrupted? His response wasn't concern. It was public theatrical prayer. He called in other ministers. He turned his daughter's illness into a public spectacle. And the girls, they learned something powerful. In a society where children were to be seen and not heard, they suddenly had the absolute, terrified attention of every adult in the room. All they had to do was point. They pointed at Tituba first, the safest target. An enslaved woman with no rights, no allies. Then Sarah Good, the beggar. Sarah Osborne, the scandal. It followed a pattern you'd expect. But then something shifted. The finger moved. It moved up the social ladder. In March of 1692, they accused Martha Corey. Now Martha Corey was different. She was a full, covenanted member of the church. She was pious, outspoken, and she openly doubted the girls' credibility. When the magistrates came for her, she mocked them. She said the whole thing was nonsense. Her skepticism was her death sentence. The girls writhed in the courtroom, claiming her specter was tormenting them. She was convicted. Then came Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, a grandmother, kind, devout, universally respected. Her accusation sent a shockwave through the community. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then anyone could be a witch. The trials were no longer just about social misfits. They were a virus, and they had jumped to a new host, the respectable class. And this is where the official story usually pauses. It talks about mass hysteria. It talks about religious fanaticism. It talks about the fear of the devil in a new world. And all of that is true as far as it goes. But it doesn't answer the real question. It doesn't explain the pattern. Because if you look at a map of Salem Village in 1692 and you plot the homes of the accusers, and then you plot the homes of the accused, you start to see something. A fault line. The old village feud, the one about independence from Salem town, begins to reappear. The accusing families, by and large, were from the western part of the village, the pro-Paris separatist faction. The accused, they were often from the eastern part, or they were families with ties to Salem town, the ones who opposed Paris and his push for independence. It's a little too neat, isn't it? A little too convenient. A spiritual crisis that just happens to reignite a decades-old property and political dispute. You'd think someone would have noticed the coincidence, but nobody did. Or, at least, nobody powerful enough to stop it did. Because by spring, the machinery had its own momentum. A special court was established. The accusations flew faster. The jails filled up. And with every conviction, a legal process was set in motion. A process not just of spiritual purification, but of material transfer. A person convicted of witchcraft was legally dead. Their property could not pass to their heirs. It was forfeit. And that brings us back to that first farm, the 300 acres. It belonged to a woman named Martha Carrier. She was accused in May, convicted and hanged in August. She was called the Queen of Hell by Cotton Mather. And when she was gone, her farm, that valuable, cleared riverfront land, it went up for grabs. But Martha Carrier was just the beginning. She was a test case, a proof of concept. And once that concept was proven, the pattern would repeat again and again, targeting lands that were far more valuable and families that were far more powerful. The hysteria provided the cover. The law provided the mechanism. So the next time you hear about the Salem Witch Trials, I want you to picture something besides girls screaming in a courtroom. Picture a map. Picture property lines. Picture a bitter, petty village feud that found, in the fear of the devil, the perfect weapon. Because the story of Salem isn't just a story about ghosts and spells. It's a story about deeds. And the map of who owned what after the terror ended tells a completely different story. So they're telling you it was about religion, about fear of the devil in the wilderness, about teenage girls having fits. And that's the story. A tragic, superstitious fever dream that swept through a pious village. But you don't build a gallows for 20 people because of a bad dream. You don't press an 80-year-old man to death with stones because a teenager had a tantrum. You don't fill a jail to bursting with over 100 souls, men, women, children, on the word of a few accusers. Not unless something else is going on, something with a harder edge than hysteria. To understand what that something else might have been, you have to look at the ground. Not at the sermons or the trial transcripts, but at the dirt, the soil of Salem Village. Because the story of Salem is, first and always, a story about land. Who owned it, who wanted it, and who stood in the way. Now, Salem in 1692 wasn't one place, it was two. And the split between them is the first crack in the official story. There was Salem town, a bustling, wealthy port on the coast. Ships came and went. Merchants grew rich. It was connected, cosmopolitan for its time, and increasingly English in its outlook. Then about 5 miles inland there was Salem Village, a farming community, isolated, poorer. Its life was the rocky fields, the stubborn harvests, the long, dark winters. The town was the future. The village felt like the past. The village didn't even have its own church. It was a parish of Salem town, which meant it paid taxes to the town, and its religious and political life was largely controlled from the coast. For years, the farmers of the village had petitioned for independence. They wanted their own church, their own minister, their own political identity. They wanted to be separate from the wealthy merchants whose interests were so different from their own. This created a deep, simmering factionalism. You were either pro-independence or you were pro-town. Your position on this issue dictated everything: who you did business with, who you married, who you trusted. And right in the middle of this fault line was the church, or more precisely, the choice of minister. In 1689, after years of conflict, Salem Village finally got its own church. And who did they choose as their first minister? A man named Samuel Parris. Now, Parris is a key. He's not some rustic, backwoods preacher. He's a failed merchant. He tried his hand in the sugar trade down in Barbados, lost his family's money, and came north looking for a new start. He's a man with expensive tastes and a profound sense of grievance. He negotiated a brutally good contract for himself with the village, a salary, a grant of land, and most importantly, the deed to the parsonage and the land it sat on. In a time when ministers were usually given a house to live in, Parris owned his. Outright. This didn't sit well with everyone. A faction in the village, led by the Porter family, who were wealthy, connected to Salem town, and anti-independence, stopped paying their taxes that were meant for Parris's salary. They argued the land deal was illegal. So here you have Parris, a proud, angry man locked in a bitter financial and legal dispute with a powerful segment of his own congregation. His position, his property, his entire future in the new world was under direct threat. And where did he live? In the parsonage. With his daughter, Betty, who was 9, his niece, Abigail Williams, who was 11, and an enslaved couple he'd brought from Barbados, John Indian and a woman named Tituba. This is the Crucible, an isolated house in a divided village, a minister fighting for his livelihood. And in the deep winter of 1692 in that house, the girls began to act strangely. They had fits. They screamed. They contorted. They said they were being pinched and pricked by invisible hands. The local doctor, William Griggs, was called, and after he examined them, he gave the diagnosis that would light the fuse. He said the evil hand was upon them. Witchcraft. Paris, of course, led the prayers. He pressed the girls. Who is doing this to you? Who is tormenting you? And the names began to come out. The first 3 accused: Tituba, the enslaved woman in Paris's own household; Sarah Good, a destitute beggar woman who went door to door asking for handouts; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly, sickly woman who was embroiled in a nasty inheritance dispute over her late husband's land that, by the way, would have reverted to the village if she died without a clear heir. Do you see the pattern starting to form? An enslaved woman with no rights, a homeless beggar, a sick old woman sitting on contested property. These are not powerful people. These are the vulnerable, the expendable, the perfect first targets. Nobody of consequence would raise a fuss to defend them. But here's where it gets weird. The accusations didn't stop there. They never do. Once you unlock that particular door, it's very hard to close it. The girls' afflictions continued. More names were demanded. And the accusations began to spread like a stain across the map of Salem Village. And this is the part nobody talks about. If you take a map of Salem Village in 1692 and you put a pin on the home of every accuser, and then a different colored pin on the home of every person accused in those first crucial months, a picture emerges. It's not random. The accusers, by and large, were clustered in the western part of the village, near the parsonage. This was the poorer, more pro-independence faction. The accused, they were often from the eastern part of the village, closer to Salem town and the Ipswich Road, the area associated with the wealthier, pro-town families like the Porters, the very families who were refusing to pay Paris's salary. It starts to look less like a supernatural plague and more like a targeted social purge, a weaponization of fear. The Western faction, led by the Putnam family, who were Paris's most ardent supporters, were accusing their eastern neighbors they had land disputes with, neighbors who were politically opposed to them, neighbors who had better connections to the wealth and power of Salem town. You'd think someone would have noticed this, right? That a magistrate might have looked at this pattern and said, "Hold on, Rebecca Nurse is a 71-year-old woman of spotless reputation, and she's being accused by the daughter of a man who's been trying to buy a piece of her family's farm for a decade. Isn't that convenient?" But nobody did, because the mechanism they unleashed was too perfect. The testimony of the afflicted girls was given immense weight. Their fits in the courtroom were considered evidence. To question the accuser was to side with the devil. It was a closed loop, an unstoppable engine, and the engine needed fuel. It needed more accusations, more specters seen in the night, more names whispered in a fit. The girls at the center of this, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and soon a growing circle of their friends, found themselves with a power they could never have imagined. They were the oracles. Their every twitch was scrutinized. Their every word was law. What must that have felt like? For a young woman in a Puritan society, where you were meant to be silent, obedient, and invisible, to suddenly have the entire colony hanging on your every scream. But that's a question for later. For now, the map is the story. A community tearing itself apart along its oldest, deepest scar. And the accusations are about to take a decisive turn. They're about to move beyond the outcasts and the easy targets. They're about to climb the social ladder. Because the first person of real, substantial wealth and standing is about to hear her name called out in the meeting house. And her name is Martha Corey. So we've looked at the official story they still teach in school. And we've looked at the map, the one that shows a pattern nobody wants to talk about. Now, we need to meet the people who started it all. Because the story of Salem is always told as a story about the accused. But to understand what really happened, you have to start with the accusers. In the winter of 1692, in the parsonage of Salem Village, a small group of girls began to act strangely. They were the daughters and cousins and servants of the local minister, Samuel Parris. The core group was small. There was his daughter, Betty Parris, she was 9. His niece, Abigail Williams, about 11. And then their friends, Ann Putnam Jr., 12. Mercy Lewis, 17, who worked as a servant in the Putnam household. Mary Walcott, 16. Elizabeth Hubbard, 17, who worked for the local doctor. A few others would join later, but these were the originals. They were the spark. Now the official story says these girls were seized by fits. They would scream. They would contort their bodies. They would complain of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. They would fall into trances. They would bark like dogs. You've heard this part. It's the classic image of the witch trial hysteria. Young girls writhing on the floor of the meeting house, pointing bony fingers at cowering old women. But here's the part that should bother you. These weren't just random children having a collective breakdown. They were a specific group, from specific families, in a specific village that was already tearing itself apart. And their behavior, it wasn't constant. It would come and go. It would flare up in public during church services when everyone was watching. And then, in private, according to some later accounts, they would seem perfectly normal. They'd be quiet, even playful. Draw your own conclusions. The thing is, in a Puritan community, there were very few outlets for young women. Your life was scripted. Obedience, piety, hard work, and then marriage and children. That was it. There was no stage, no voice. Unless, of course, you became a vessel for something else, something supernatural. Suddenly, these girls, servants, children, were the center of the entire town's attention. Ministers came to pray over them. Doctors came to examine them. The entire community hung on their every twitch and cry. They had power, absolute, terrifying power, and they learned very quickly how to use it. When pressed to name who was tormenting them, they did. First, they named 3 women who were, let's say, easy targets. Sarah Good was a beggar, irritable and sharp-tongued. Sarah Osborne was elderly, sickly, and embroiled in a land dispute with the Putnam family. Remember that name, Putnam. And Tituba was the Parris family's enslaved woman from Barbados. She was an outsider in every possible way. She told stories from her homeland, stories that didn't come from the Bible. She was the perfect first suspect. Tituba, under pressure and likely fearing for her life, did something brilliant. She confessed, but she didn't just confess for herself. She gave them a story, a grand, elaborate story. She spoke of a tall man from Boston, of a book with 9 other names in it, of witches, meetings in the parsonage field. She confirmed everything the girls said and then expanded the plot. She gave the panic a narrative, a conspiracy, and in doing so, she saved herself. She was never executed. After the confessions, the accusations were no longer just about a few troubled girls. They were about a satanic conspiracy infiltrating Salem. The hunt was officially on. But let's pull back for a second. These girls, look at their situations. Ann Putnam Jr., her mother Ann Putnam Sr., had lost multiple children in infancy. The Putnam family was steeped in grief and, as we'll see, simmering resentment over land and status. Mercy Lewis and Elizabeth Hubbard were servants. Their lives were ones of hard labor with little prospect of anything better. Abigail Williams was an orphan living in her uncle's strict household. These were not carefree children. They lived in a world of constant fear. Fear of Indian attacks on the frontier, fear of smallpox, fear of God's wrath, fear of their neighbors. And now, they had found a way to turn that fear outward, to become the ones who caused fear instead of the ones who felt it. You'd think someone would have noticed the pattern, right? That the fits seemed to have a strategic timing. That the accusations, after those first easy 3, began to follow a certain logic. But when you're in the middle of a panic, logic is the first thing to go. The community needed an explanation for its own suffering, for the failed crops, the sick children, the political strife. The girls provided one. And the authorities, men like Samuel Parris and the local magistrates, were all too ready to believe, because believing the girls meant they could do something. They could root out the evil. They could restore order. Their order. I'm curious what you think about this. Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, tonight's a good night for that. Now, this is the part nobody talks about. The accusations didn't stay in the realm of the poor and the powerless for long. Once the mechanism was in place, the dramatic testimony of the afflicted girls was all the evidence you needed. It could be aimed. And it was aimed with startling precision. The girls, perhaps guided by the adults around them, perhaps acting on their own grudges, began to name names that would have been unthinkable just months before. They accused Martha Corey. She was a full, covenanted member of the church, pious, outspoken. She dismissed the girls' antics from the start, calling them nonsense. That was her crime. She doubted. And for that, she was named a witch. Then they accused Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old. A mother of 8, universally respected. Her family had long been at odds with the Putnam family over land and church politics. She was the kind of woman whose character should have been her shield. It was. The girls' power was now absolute. To question them was to risk becoming a target yourself. If you said, "This is madness," you might be next. So the community fell in line. The jails began to fill, and with every new accusation, the stakes got higher. The girls weren't just naming social outcasts anymore. They were naming pillars of the community. They were naming people with property, with standing. So you have to ask yourself, what changes when the accused is a beggar versus when the accused is a wealthy landowner? What happens to that land, that property, when its owner is convicted of witchcraft and executed? The law had an answer for that. And in Salem, the law was about to be put to use. Stay with me here, because we've met the accusers. We've seen how this started. A group of troubled, powerless girls who found the one way to have a voice in a world that silenced them. But their voice became a weapon. And soon, someone else would be holding the handle, aiming the blade. Next, we meet the accused. Not the first 3, but the ones that changed everything. The prominent women. The ones who had something to lose. So we've met the accusers. A small group of girls trapped in a rigid, isolated village whose strange fits ignited the tinder. But a fire needs fuel. And in Salem, the fuel was a very specific kind of person. You don't just point at anyone and have the whole town agree they're in league with the devil. No, the accusation has to land. It has to feel plausible. It has to serve a purpose. Tonight, let's meet the first 3 women who were formally accused, arrested, and put on trial. Their names are in every history book: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. They're presented as the obvious first targets, the outcasts, the easy picks. And on the surface, that's true. But look closer at who they were and, more importantly, what they had, and a pattern starts to form. A pattern that has less to do with spectral evidence and more to do with deeds, boundaries, and cold, hard land. First, Sarah Good. You've probably heard of her. She's the archetype. Poor to the point of desperation. She wandered from house to house, begging for food or shelter, often with her young children in tow. She was sharp-tongued. If you refused her, she'd mutter something under her breath as she walked away. And in a Puritan community where every word was supposed to be measured and godly, that mutter was enough. It could be construed as a curse. She was the village burden, the kind of person whose disappearance might, in a cruel calculus, be seen as a relief. An easy target, right? A woman with no money, no powerful friends, no social capital at all. But here's the part that should bother you. Sarah Good wasn't always destitute. She was born Sarah Solart into a relatively well-off family. Her father was a prosperous innkeeper who left a sizable estate when he died. So what happened? The money, the property, it all slipped away through a series of bad marriages and legal disputes. By 1692, Sarah Good was a beggar, but she wasn't just a beggar. She was a beggar with a claim. A lingering, messy, unresolved claim to property that had once been her family's. She was a living reminder of a fractured inheritance, a loose end. And loose ends have a way of getting trimmed. Then we have Sarah Osborne. Now her case is different. She wasn't a beggar. In fact, Sarah Osborne was at the center of a scandal that had already rocked Salem Village years before the witch panic. She'd been the widow of a wealthy man, Robert Prince, who owned a valuable farm. He died, leaving the farm to his 2 young sons. Sarah, as the widow, was supposed to manage it for them until they came of age. Standard practice. But then she did something that made the entire village look at her sideways. She hired an Irish indentured servant named Alexander Osborne to help run the farm. And then she married him. This was a problem on multiple levels. First, he was her servant. That blurred social lines in a way that made people deeply uncomfortable. Second, and more concretely, by marrying Alexander, Sarah effectively took control of the Prince family farm away from her own sons. She and her new husband began to treat the property as their own, cutting the sons out of their inheritance. The boy's legal guardian, a man named John Putnam, yes, that Putnam family, had been fighting her in court for years. So when the accusations started flying in 1692, Sarah Osborne wasn't just a socially awkward older woman. She was a defendant in an ongoing, bitter property dispute. She was sitting on a farm that a powerful village family believed belonged to them. You'd think someone would have noticed the coincidence, right? A beggar with a latent property claim, and a widow entangled in a vicious land dispute. 2 women, 2 different kinds of poverty, but both of them obstacles to clean, clear ownership. And then there's Tituba. This is where the official story gets murky, and where you have to read between the lines of every account written by the men who won. Tituba was enslaved in the household of Reverend Samuel Paris, the minister at the heart of the storm. She was, by most accounts, not from Africa, but from the Caribbean, possibly an Arawak Indian from South America, or of mixed African and indigenous heritage. She was, in every sense, an outsider. Her customs, her knowledge of herbs and stories, her very presence was foreign. And according to the girls, it was Tituba who entertained them with tales from her homeland, who helped them try to see their future husbands in an egg white dropped in a glass, a classic folk divination practice, but pure witchcraft in Puritan eyes. When the fits began, the pressure fell on Tituba first. She was questioned, and after severe prompting, she confessed. Oh, did she confess? She gave them everything they wanted. Tales of a tall man from Boston who made her sign a book, of riding on sticks through the air, of other witches in the village. Her confession was the spark that turned the panic into a bonfire. It confirmed the girls' stories. It made it all real. But stay with me here. Why did she confess? The story goes that Paris beat her to extract the confession. Later accounts suggest she spun her tales to save her own life, giving the authorities what they wanted to hear. And it worked. She wasn't executed. She lingered in jail for over a year and was eventually sold to pay for her prison fees. Her fate after that is unknown. But think about her position. She was property, Samuel Paris's property, and Reverend Paris was in a precarious spot. His ministry was failing. He was unpopular. His salary was in dispute, and now his own household was the epicenter of this diabolical outbreak. His own daughter and niece were the first afflicted. His credibility, his very position, was on the line. Tituba's confession didn't just validate the witch hunt. It exonerated him. It shifted the blame from his home, from his failure to control his own family and servants, onto outside, diabolical forces. Her confession saved his skin. And as property, she was the one person in this whole saga who had absolutely no claim to anything. No land, no money, no freedom. She was a tool, used to legitimize the process that would soon target people who did have something to lose. So look at this first trio. Really look at them. A beggar with a complicated past claim, a widow blocking a key inheritance, and an enslaved woman whose testimony provided the crucial blueprint for the panic while shielding her owner from blame. This isn't a random sampling of village misfits. This is a targeted list. Each accusation served a function, solved a problem, or removed an obstacle. Now, the magistrates had their witches. The girls had named them. Tituba had confirmed the dark conspiracy, and the village was in an uproar. The legal machinery, slow and ponderous in the Massachusetts colony, began to grind into motion. A special court would need to be convened, evidence would need to be gathered, and a precedent would need to be set. What do you do with the first people you've ever formally accused of witchcraft in your new, desperate colony? You make an example. And in the spring of 1692, Salem was about to learn what that example looked like. The accusations were one thing, but the punishment would change everything. It would answer the one question everyone was secretly asking. How far were they willing to go? Next time, the first hanging and the first question. Because when the gallows were built, someone finally dared to ask why. So the accusations have been made. The prominent women are in chains. The court is in session, led by men who believe they are doing God's work by listening to the convulsions of teenage girls. The town is holding its breath. Everyone is waiting to see what happens next. You'd think, with so much at stake, with human lives hanging in the balance, that the first execution would be for one of the big names. For Rebecca Nurse, the pious grandmother everyone respected. Or for Bridget Bishop, the tavern keeper with the flashy clothes and the sharp tongue who'd already been suspected of witchcraft years before. They're the obvious targets, right? But that's not what happens. The first person to climb the ladder to the gallows is someone else entirely. A woman who, on the surface, seems like an outlier. A woman named Bridget Bishop. Wait, you say, you just mentioned her. I did. And she will hang, but she is not the first. The first is Sarah Good. Sarah Good is poor. She is homeless. She wanders from house to house with her children, begging for food or shelter. She mutters when she's turned away. She smokes a pipe. She is, in every sense, the easiest target imaginable. She has no powerful family. No friends in high places, no estate to protect. She is social driftwood. And when the girls start screaming that Sarah Good's specter is pinching them and choking them, who is going to stand up and say otherwise? Nobody. But here's where it gets weird. At her examination, they ask her the standard question. If she isn't a witch, then who is tormenting these girls? It's a trap, a theological trap. To deny witchcraft entirely is to deny the power of the devil, which is itself a kind of heresy. So they force the accused to name names, to redirect the hysteria. And Sarah Good, cornered, exhausted, perhaps just spiteful, points a finger. She says it's Sarah Osborne. Now, Sarah Osborne is a different story. She's not destitute. She's a woman of some property, but she's made herself unpopular. She hadn't gone to church in over a year. She'd been living with her servant, a man named Alexander Osborne, before they were married. Scandalous. She's also been involved in a nasty legal fight over her first husband's will. She's got enemies. She's got land people might want. She is, in other words, a much more interesting target for the accusers than poor, wandering Sarah Good. But Sarah Osborne never makes it to the gallows. She dies in prison on May 10th, 1692, chained to a wall in a Boston jail. The official cause is natural. You can draw your own conclusions about what dying in 17th century prison chains does to a person. So Sarah Good remains, and the court moves with a speed that should tell you something. This isn't about careful deliberation. This is about momentum. They need a verdict. They need a hanging. They need to make this real. On June 2nd, Bridget Bishop is tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. She's the tavern owner, the one with the red paragon bodice, the one whose place was a haunt for young men and, according to testimony, where people played shovelboard, a game. Frivolity. Sin. The case against her is a heap of spectral nonsense. She pinched people, she appeared as a specter, her shape flew in a window. But the clincher? Workmen testified they found poppets made of rags and hogs' bristles hidden in the walls of her cellar. Witch dolls. Now nobody confirmed this, but think about the timing. These poppets were discovered after she was already arrested and her property was being examined. By whom? For what purpose? Stay with me here. Bridget Bishop is hanged on June 10th, 1692. She is the first official execution. The town watches, the ministers watch, the judges watch. A woman is dead because teenage girls said she sent her ghost to hurt them, because dolls were found in a wall. The line has been crossed. The ritual is complete. Blood has been spilled. And the reaction in Salem Village is not horror. It's not a collective gasp of what have we done. It's a release, a permission. Because now the real question presents itself. The first hanging answers one thing: yes, we will kill for this. But it asks another, far more dangerous question. A question that would have been unthinkable just months before. If we can hang Bridget Bishop for her tavern and her bodice and those dolls in the wall, what's stopping us from hanging anyone else? That's the first question. And its answer is nothing. Nothing at all. So the accusations which had been bubbling now boil over, but they change direction. They become bolder, more strategic. The girls, perhaps sensing their power was now absolute, or perhaps being guided by hands they didn't even recognize, start pointing at targets that would have been utterly shielded by their social standing before that June day. They point at a woman named Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, a pillar of the church, a mother and grandmother, deeply respected. Her family owns a good deal of farmland. Her initial verdict: not guilty. The jury comes back with a verdict of not guilty. Can you imagine the silence in that room, the sheer, stunning defiance of it? The girls erupt, they writhe, they scream. The judges are alarmed. One of them, a man named William Stoughton, steps in. He asks the jury to reconsider. He points out that nurse during her examination had failed to answer one question directly. She'd been hard of hearing, confused. He tells the jury to go back and think about that. They do. They change their verdict. Guilty. Nobody ever asked why a judge would so blatantly intervene to secure a guilty verdict against a sick, old, pious woman. At least, nobody in power asked. Rebecca Nurse is excommunicated from her own church, and she is sentenced to hang. But here's the part that should bother you. The Nurse family had connections. They had resources. They petitioned the governor. And Governor Phipps, reeling from the speed of it all, issues a reprieve. A pardon. Rebecca Nurse is saved. Word gets back to Salem. The accusers are enraged. The ministers are agitated. They claim the governor has been deceived. That dark forces are at work. And under this pressure, this sheer, vocal, hysterical pressure, the governor does something telling. He rescinds the pardon. He takes it back. So why did nobody stop him? Why did a colonial governor, the highest authority in the province, buckle to the demands of a village court and a group of screaming children? What did he see, or what did he fear that made him send an innocent old woman to her death? Rebecca Nurse is hanged on July 19th, 1692, along with 4 others. They call it a gallows day. But in the crowd that day, watching his mother being murdered by the state, is a man named Samuel Nurse. And Samuel is not a beggar. He's not a wanderer. He's a landowning farmer. He's part of the system. And he has just seen the system devour his family. He's not the only one watching. Because by this point, the accusations have begun to spiral outward beyond the village borders toward the port town of Salem town itself, toward men and women of even greater stature. And there, in the crowd, or hearing the reports as they spread, is a man in a black robe, a minister, but not from Salem. He's from Boston. And he's starting to write something down, something that will change everything. So the first man is dead. Giles Corey pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea. The first woman is dead. Bridget Bishop hanged on Gallows Hill. The machinery is in motion. The court is in session. The girls are screaming. And the land, the good, contested, valuable land, is starting to change hands. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? A couple of executions, the point is made, the hysteria burns itself out. That's how these things usually go. But Salem wasn't usual. It was just getting started. Because now the people who built that machinery, the judges, the ministers, the men who signed the arrest warrants, they have a problem. A big one. The problem isn't the accused. They've shown they can deal with the accused. The problem is one of their own. His name was Samuel Willard, and he was the minister of the Old South Church in Boston. Not some backwater village preacher. Boston, the big city, the intellectual and political center of the colony. He was respected, learned, and he'd been watching what was happening up in Essex County with a kind of horrified disbelief. He saw the pattern early. Maybe because he was at a distance. Maybe because he wasn't tangled up in the local feuds over pasture rights and minister salaries. He looked at the accusations flying out of Salem Village, and he didn't see a sudden, supernatural plague of witchcraft. He saw something far more human and far more dangerous. He saw a legal process that was broken. The so-called evidence. The fits of the girls, their claims of being pinched and bitten by invisible specters. Willard called it what it was, nonsense, dangerous nonsense. You can't convict someone of a capital crime because a teenager says she saw their ghostly shape sitting on her chest in the middle of the night. That's not evidence. That's a story. A story that can't be checked, can't be verified, can't be challenged. And Willard said so, publicly. He started preaching about it. He wrote private letters to other ministers, letters that would have been explosive if they'd gotten out. He argued that spectral evidence, The idea that a witch could send her spirit out to torment others was a theological and legal dead end. If the devil could take the shape of an innocent person to do his work, then anyone could be accused. Your neighbor, your enemy, the man who owns the meadow you've been eyeing. He was drawing a line in the sand. And he was drawing it right in front of the most powerful men in the colony. Now, here's where it gets weird. Or maybe where it gets perfectly logical. The court in Salem, led by Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, didn't try to argue with Willard on the finer points of theology. They didn't engage him in a debate. They did something much more effective. They silenced him. They spread rumors. They whispered that Willard himself was under suspicion, that his name had come up in the examinations. This was the genius and the brutality of the system they'd created. Question the process. You must be part of the conspiracy. Speak up for the accused. You might be next. It was a perfect, self-sealing trap. Willard was forced to pull back, to go quiet. His public sermons became more cautious. Those private letters, they stopped. The threat was understood. He had a congregation to protect, his own position to consider. The message from Salem was clear. Stay in your Boston pulpit. Tend to your own flock. This is not your concern. But it worked for a little while, because it scared other people too. If a man of Samuel Willard's stature could be threatened into silence, what chance did a farmer from Topsfield have? What chance did a wife from Andover have? The opposition was being managed, neutered before it could even form, and the trials rolled on. But Willard's argument, the one about spectral evidence, it didn't disappear. It was like a slow-burning fuse. He'd planted the idea. It was out there. And it started to find its way into other minds, other conversations, in parlors and taverns where people were beginning to have their doubts. The initial panic was starting to wear off, replaced by a colder, creeping dread. They'd hanged Bridget Bishop. They'd pressed Giles Corey. And the girls were still screaming. The accusations were spreading, not slowing down. They were moving beyond Salem Village into other towns, which leads us to the second man. The one who decided to pick up where Willard left off, but from inside the beast itself. This was Thomas Brattle. He wasn't a minister. He was a merchant, a mathematician, a man of numbers and reason, a fellow of the Royal Society in London, which tells you something about the kind of mind he had. He was wealthy, connected, and he lived right there in Salem town. He wasn't watching from Boston. He was smelling the smoke from Gallows Hill. Brattle attended the trials. He listened. He took notes. And what he saw made his rational, scientific mind recoil. He saw judges who led the witnesses. He saw defendants who were assumed guilty from the moment they entered the room. He saw the touch test, where a girl in a fit would be brought to the accused, and if her fit stopped when the accused touched her, that was proof of witchcraft. Think about that. If the fit didn't stop, it was proof the witch was stubborn. If it did stop, it was proof she was guilty. It was a test you couldn't pass. Brattle, like Willard, zeroed in on the spectral evidence. But he went further. He wrote it all down. Every logical flaw, every procedural horror, every violation of basic English common law. And in October of 1692, after 5 more people had been hanged in a single day, he sat down and did what Samuel Willard could no longer do. He wrote a letter, not a private, cautious note, a blistering 8,000-word public treatise. He addressed it to an unnamed Reverend minister in Boston, but he knew copies would be made. It would be passed from hand to hand. It would be read aloud. It was meant to be public. In this letter, Brattle dismantled the trials piece by piece. He mocked the credibility of the accusers. He eviscerated the court's methods. He pointed out the obvious, that the afflicted girls were clearly coordinating their stories, that their fits were theatrical, that they could be calm and composed one moment and writhing on the floor the next if it suited them. He saved his coldest scorn for the judges, especially Stoughton. He wrote that the court had already made use of a great deal of a bad spirit and that their proceedings were perfectly diabolical. Think about the courage that took, or the outrage that fueled it. He was calling the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts Bay, the head of the Witchcraft court, diabolical, to his face. But Brattle was clever. He wasn't just shouting. He was offering the powerful men in Boston a way out. He framed his criticism not as rebellion, but as a defense of law, order, and property. He argued that this hysteria was destabilizing the entire colony, that it would make Massachusetts a laughingstock in London, that it threatened everyone's land titles, everyone's inheritances, if convictions could be based on phantom evidence. He was speaking their language, the language of power and property, and his letter worked. It became the catalyst. It landed in Boston like a bombshell. Finally, here was a coherent, undeniable, and deeply embarrassing case against the trials, written by one of their own. A merchant, a man of substance, not a suspected witch or a soft-hearted dissenter. The fuse that Samuel Willard had lit was now touching powder. The rational, propertied men of Boston, who had been willing to look the other way while it was just a few troublesome women in a distant village, were now getting nervous. The chaos was spreading. And Thomas Brattle had just handed them a detailed report on how bad it really was. The pressure began to build. Whispers in the governor's council turned into arguments. The governor himself, William Phipps, was starting to look bad in reports sent back to England. But down in Salem, William Stoughton and his court weren't backing down. They had momentum. They had divine purpose. They had more people in the jail, waiting. The conflict was no longer between the accusers and the accused. It was now a battle for the soul of the colony's authority. And at the very center of that battle was a single, unanswerable question. What do you do when the only proof you have is a ghost story? The spectral evidence. That was the keystone. And that keystone was about to crack. So the Reverend Samuel Parris is in his meeting house, watching his daughter and niece writhe on the floor, and he's got a problem. A theological one. He's a Puritan minister. He believes in a literal devil, literal demons, a literal spiritual war for every soul in Salem Village. But he also believes in a very specific, very strict set of rules for proving anything in a court of law. You need evidence. You need witnesses. You need a confession, or at least two people who saw the same crime with their own eyes. But what do you do when the crime is invisible? What do you do when the only witnesses are these tormented girls, pointing at empty air and screaming that Rebecca Nurse or Martha Corey is pinching them, biting them, sitting on their chests at night? You can't see the witch. You can't see the specter. Only the afflicted can. This was the legal and religious trapdoor that opened beneath everyone's feet in the spring of 1692. They called it spectral evidence. The testimony of the afflicted that the specter, the ghostly shape of the accused, was tormenting them. And here's the part that should bother you. This wasn't a new idea. In earlier witch trials in England, and even in New England, judges had been deeply, deeply suspicious of it. How could you prove a specter was who the accuser said it was? The devil, after all, was the father of lies. He could take any shape he wanted. He could appear as an innocent person just to sow chaos and get good Christians to kill each other. That was basic Puritan theology. So why, in Salem, did it suddenly become the centerpiece of the entire legal process? Stay with me here. The first official panel to examine the accused was just a local magistrate's court. 2 judges, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, not trained lawyers, but wealthy, prominent men in the community. And from the very first interrogation, Bridget Bishop's back in March, they leaned into the Spectral. The girls would shriek and collapse. Hathorne would turn to the accused and demand, "Why do you hurt these children?" He wasn't asking for physical proof. He was accepting the affliction as proof. The reaction of the girls was the evidence of the crime. But it gets weirder. The specter wasn't just seen, it was interactive. The girls would claim the specter of the accused was urging them to sign the devil's book. They'd cry out that a yellow bird, the familiar spirit of the accused, was sitting on the minister's hat. And the judges would ask the accused, "What about this yellow bird? Do you see it?" When the accused, bewildered, said no, the judges took that as further evidence of their guilt. Of course, a witch could see her familiar spirit. The fact that she denied it just showed she was lying. You see the closed loop they built. The accusation creates the evidence. The denial confirms the accusation. Now, this is the part nobody talks about. It wasn't just the judges. The ministers of the colony were consulted. A formal letter was sent to the most influential clergy in Boston, asking for advice. And these weren't backwoods fanatics. These were the intellectual leaders of New England. Their response in June of 1692 is a masterpiece of nervous hedging. They warned about the danger of spectral evidence. They said it was unreliable. They said, "It is not sufficient that the specter which appears resembles such a person." But then, and this is the critical turn, they said the judges could use it. They could use it as presumption to bring someone to trial to justify an arrest. They just shouldn't use it alone for a conviction. It was a theological fig leaf, a way for the educated, powerful men in Boston to say they'd done their duty, warned about the dangers, while not actually stopping the machine that was now grinding away in Salem. Because if you tell a local judge, who is facing a room full of screaming children and a terrified, angry town, that he can use this evidence to jail someone, what do you think he's going to do? He's going to use it. The cautionary note gets lost. The permission is what echoes in the courtroom. And into this legal and spiritual quicksand stepped a new figure, a man who would take the spectral evidence problem and weaponize it. His name was William Stoughton. He was in his 60s, a politician, a merchant, a man with very strong opinions and absolutely no patience for doubt. In late May, the governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips, finally created a special court to handle the exploding crisis, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Hear and determine. And he named William Stoughton as its Chief Justice. Stoughton was a believer, not just in God, but in the literal, physical threat of the witchcraft he was about to judge. And he had a solution to the spectral evidence problem, a brutal, logical solution. He declared that the devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person. It was a theological impossibility. Therefore, if a specter was tormenting someone, and that specter looked like Goody Proctor, then Goody Proctor herself had given the devil permission. She was guilty. The specter was an extension of her will. Think about that for a second. With one pronouncement, Stoughton solved the biggest legal headache of the witch trials. He turned the Puritans' own fear of the devil's deception on its head. The devil wasn't tricky. He was a contractual partner. You had to sign up. The specter was a binding legal document. This wasn't just accepting spectral evidence. This was giving it an ironclad theological foundation. No wonder the Boston minister's gentle warnings went nowhere. Stoughton had built a fortress around the prosecution's best weapon, and the girls, they adapted. Of course they did. They were in a deadly performance, and the rules of the play had just been clarified for them by the highest judge in the land. The specters now did more than pinch and bite. They whispered secrets. They showed the accused signing the devil's book in spectral meetings in the Pasture. The testimony became a kind of dark, collaborative fiction. The accuser would describe a scene. The judge would nod. The accused would deny it, which only proved the specter was hiding the truth. It was airtight. But here's where it gets truly dark. Spectral evidence wasn't just about the accused tormenting the girls. It started to mirror property disputes. Remember the map, the geography of accusation. Listen to this. A man would testify that the specter of his neighbor, a woman he was suing over a boundary line, appeared to him at night and choked him. A farmer would say the specter of the woman whose family wanted his meadow sat on his chest and tried to kill him. The invisible war became a perfect theater for settling very visible, very earthly grievances. You couldn't prove a specter wasn't your enemy, and Chief Justice Stoughton had already ruled that if you saw it, it was them. So the court began to convict, rapidly, based on this evidence that everyone, even the ministers, knew was suspect. Bridget Bishop was hanged on June 10th. 5 more women, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Wilds, were condemned to die in late June. But even then, in the shadow of the gallows, the spectral evidence problem wouldn't stay solved. Because Rebecca Nurse was different. She was pious. She was respected. Her whole family fought for her. The jury initially came back with a verdict of not guilty. You'd think that would be it, right? A jury rejecting the spectral testimony. But William Stoughton wasn't having it. He sent the jury back. He asked them to reconsider a specific piece of testimony, a statement Nurse had made that could be twisted into a confession. He all but instructed them to find her guilty, and they did. The lesson was unmistakable. The court wasn't interested in doubt. It wasn't interested in the old, careful rules. It had a new system, blessed by its Chief Justice, and that system was delivering verdicts, and land, and silencing disputes. But a system that runs on something as slippery as a specter, it needs constant fuel. It needs new accusations, new enemies, new performances. And as the summer of 1692 burned on the girls and the judges and the accusers who now saw a perfect tool in their hands, they began to look beyond the women on the margins. They started pointing at the pillars of the community itself. And that's when they pointed at a woman who would call their entire bluff, who would look William Stoughton in the eye and dismantle his spectral logic with a single, devastating question. But that's for next time. Because before we get to her, you need to understand the room she walked into. You need to see the court that wasn't really a court at all. So the Reverend Samuel Parris has stood up in his own church and said the quiet part out loud. He's told the court, and by extension the whole town, that this spectral evidence is a dangerous fantasy, that you can't convict someone because a troubled girl says she saw their ghost. It was a brave thing to do, a principled thing, and it did exactly nothing. The court didn't pause, it didn't reconsider, it just kept going. Because by June of 1692, the machine was running itself. And the men at the levers of that machine had a problem, a legal problem. You see, Massachusetts didn't have a proper government, not anymore. Let's rewind just a bit. The old Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter, the one that gave them the right to govern themselves, had been revoked by the King of England years earlier. For years, they'd been operating under a provisional, temporary government. And then, just as the witch accusations were starting to boil over in the spring of 1692, that provisional government expired. poof, gone. So legally, as of that spring, there was no valid government in Massachusetts to try anyone for anything. No legislature, no valid governor, and crucially, no valid courts. Now, you'd think that would bring everything to a screeching halt, right? You can't legally hang a person if you don't legally exist. But the men in charge, led by the acting governor, William Phipps, saw it differently. They saw a crisis, a supernatural panic they believed was real, and they saw a power vacuum. And in that vacuum, they decided to build their own court. Governor Phipps, newly arrived from England, did two things immediately. First, he formally established the Court of Oyer and Terminer. That's an old French legal term. Oyer means to hear. Terminer means to decide. It was a special court, convened for a special emergency. His second move was to appoint the judges. And this is where you need to look at the names. This wasn't a random draw of qualified jurists. This was a very specific list. The Chief Justice was William Stoughton, a hardline Puritan, fiercely orthodox with no legal training in English common law. He was a theologian by education, a politician by trade. He believed in the literal reality of the Devil's War on New England, and he believed the court's job was to win that war. Sitting with him were men like John Hathorne, you might know that name. His descendant, Nathaniel, would add a W to it and write the scarlet letter about the shadows of this very era. Hathorne was a local Salem merchant, a magistrate. He'd been involved from the very first hearings. He'd already made up his mind. Then there was Bartholomew Gedney, a wealthy shipbuilder and merchant from Salem town. Samuel Sewall, a merchant who would later write a famous public confession of his guilt. Waitstill Winthrop, from the most powerful family in the colony. Nathaniel Saltonstall, he's an interesting one. He'd resign in disgust by the end of the summer, the only one to do so. Look at that list. Not a single trained lawyer among them, not one. They were merchants, politicians, clergymen, men of property and standing, absolutely. But men whose expertise was in account books and sermons, not rules of evidence. And that was the point. This wasn't a court of law, it was a court of belief, a court of order. Their mandate wasn't to find legal truth. It was to purge the colony of a spiritual infection. And when your Chief Justice believes the invisible world is testifying in his courtroom, due process becomes a nuisance. So the rules were, well, there were no rules, not really. The normal legal protections of English law suspended. The requirement for 2 witnesses to a crime ignored. Because how do you get a witness to a secret magical compact made with the devil? You can't. So spectral evidence, the testimony about ghosts and shapes, became not just admissible, it became the primary evidence. Think about the position this put an accused person in. How do you defend yourself against a ghost? Rebecca Nurse, that pious, elderly woman, was accused because Ann Putnam Jr. said her specter floated into the room and pinched her. What's Rebecca's defense? I was asleep in my bed. Doesn't matter. Her specter, they said, could be anywhere. Your body is here, but your demonic projection is across town, tormenting children. It's the perfect accusation. It's unfalsifiable. The judges would ask the accusers, "Is this the woman who hurts you?" The girls would fall into fits, their bodies twisting. That was entered as evidence. They'd bring the accused forward to touch a victim during a fit. If the fit stopped, it was proof the accused had caused it. If it didn't stop, it was proof the devil was preventing it. It was a closed loop. You couldn't win, and the judges leaned into it. They weren't passive referees. They were active interrogators, often hostile, often leading. They'd badger the accused. Why do you hurt these children? Not if. Why? The presumption of guilt was absolute. Now here's the part that should bother you. A few people did try to introduce some sanity. We already heard from Paris. But even within the court's own process, there was a moment where it could have stopped. The ministers of Boston, the most respected clergy in the colony, were asked for their advice, and they wrote back a cautious, careful letter. They said the proceedings should be exceedingly tender. They warned that the devil could indeed appear as an innocent person. They urged the court to be very careful with spectral evidence. It was a diplomatic way of saying, "You are on very thin ice." The court received this letter, they read it, and then they filed it away and did the exact opposite. They doubled down. Because by then, the trials weren't about determining guilt. They were about performing a ritual of purification. Each hearing, each condemnation was a public exorcism. The louder the girls screamed, the more violent their fits, the more certain the community could be that the evil was being rooted out. The theater of it was the point. And William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, was the master of ceremonies. He had a particular move, a final rhetorical flourish that he used when a jury dared to return a verdict he didn't like. It happened in the case of Rebecca Nurse. The jury initially came back with a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The accusers howled. Stoughton, furious, instructed the jury to go back and reconsider. He pointed out that the accused had, at one point in her testimony, remained silent when a question was asked. He suggested this sarcastic silence was a confession. He sent them back to deliberate. They came back with a guilty verdict. That's not a judge. That's a prosecutor in a judge's robe. That's a man with an outcome already in mind, bending the process until it fits. So you have a court that legally shouldn't exist, run by men with no legal training, using evidence that wouldn't be admissible in any real court to fight a war against an invisible enemy. The verdicts were a foregone conclusion. The only thing left was the sentencing, and Stoughton never hesitated. He signed the death warrants with a firm hand. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge were busy that summer. But the reach of this court was about to expand beyond the desperate, the outspoken, the vulnerable women on the margins. The machine was humming, and it was about to turn its attention to a different kind of target. Someone with real, tangible, valuable property that certain powerful men had looked at for a long, long time. Because the next man to find himself standing before William Stoughton and his judges didn't live in a small farmhouse. He lived at a strategic crossroads. He owned the Ferry. Now the court is in session. The girls are screaming, the nooses are being tied, the town is in a fever. And you'd think in the middle of all that the business of the village would just stop. That people would be too consumed by the terror to think about anything else. But that's not how it works. Not in a crisis. A crisis is a distraction. And a distraction is the perfect time to get things done. Quiet things, business things. Which brings us to a man named John Willard. You haven't met him yet. He's not one of the first accused. He's not a minister. He's not a magistrate. He's a constable. A village constable for Salem Village. That's an important job. It means he's the one who serves warrants, who makes arrests, who, when the court orders someone seized and taken to the jail in Salem town, is the man who puts his hands on them. He's also, and this is the part that matters, the owner of the ferry. Stay with me here. This is a key piece of geography. Salem Village, where all this hysteria is centered, is inland. It's farms and meeting houses. Salem town, where the real power is, where the courthouse is, where the jail is a port on the coast. Between them lies the Ipswich River. To get from the village to the town, you either go the long way around by land, which is a full day's journey on bad roads, or you take the ferry across the river and then travel a much shorter, easier road. The ferry is the choke point, the toll bridge. the only efficient way to move people and goods from the inland farms to the coastal market. And John Willard owned it. So think about the mechanics of what's happening. An accusation is made. The magistrates issue a warrant. Constable John Willard rides out to the farm, arrests the accused witch, often a woman, often alone, often terrified, and escorts her to the ferry. He charges her a fee for the passage. He takes her across the river. He then delivers her to the town jail. Later, when she's brought to trial, he's the one who transports her again. Another fee. And if she's convicted and sentenced to hang, he'd be the one to take her to Gallows Hill. You see the pattern. Every step of the judicial process, from accusation to execution, funneled through his business. He had a financial stake, a direct and literal monetary interest in every single arrest. Now, nobody confirmed this, but you have to wonder, did the accused pay their own fare? Or did their families, desperate and scrambling, have to scrape together the coin to pay the man who was carting their mother, their wife, their sister to her death? The records are silent on that, conveniently silent. And here's the part that should bother you. For months, Willard does this job. He's a key cog in the machine. He's profiting from the panic. He's seen it all. He's hauled the pious Rebecca Nurse. He's handled the outspoken Sarah Good. He's been up close. He's heard their protests, seen their fear. And at some point in the spring of 1692, something in John Willard shifts. The story goes that he started to voice doubts, quietly at first. He's reported to have said he was sick of blood, that the whole business was wrong, that the accusations were getting out of hand. He supposedly refused to arrest more people. He looked at the machinery he was helping to run, and he decided he wanted off. This, of course, was not an option. In May of 1692, the accusations turned. They always do. When you're inside a system that feeds on fear, the moment you stop feeding it, you become the food. The afflicted girls, those perceptive young women, suddenly began to writhe and shriek in the presence of Constable John Willard. They claimed his specter was tormenting them. They said he was a witch. Think about the sheer, brutal efficiency of that. The man who knows the logistics, who sees the receipts, who has doubts. Silence him. Not with an argument, not with a debate. Brand him as the enemy. Make him the next target. He was arrested on May 18th by his own colleagues, taken on his own ferry, presumably after paying his fare to his replacement. He was thrown into the same jail he had delivered so many others to. Now, this is the part nobody talks about. Willard's case is different. He wasn't some contentious woman on the outskirts of the village. He was an official, a man with property, a ferry owner. They couldn't just railroad him without some extra effort. So they did what they always did when they needed to make a case stick. They expanded the conspiracy. They accused his wife, Margaret, of being a witch, too. They accused his grandfather, a respected man named Bray Wilkins, who was 81 years old. The story goes that when Bray heard his own grandson was accused, he was so horrified he developed a sudden, painful urinary infection. This physical ailment was naturally presented in court as evidence of John Willard's witchcraft, that he had afflicted his own grandfather for daring to believe the accusations. You see how it works. It's a virus. It attacks the bonds of family, of duty, of common sense. It turns a man's own bodily suffering into proof of his grandson's guilt. Willard was tried quickly. The spectral evidence was, as always, irrefutable because it was impossible to refute. The girls screamed. They pointed. They said his invisible shape was pinching them, and the court believed them. He was hanged on August 19th, 1692, on Gallows Hill. One of 5 people executed that day. A day they called a great execution. He went to his death proclaiming his innocence, a last, futile act of defiance against the machine he had once operated. But the story of John Willard doesn't end with the rope. It ends with the ferry, because here's the quiet, bureaucratic aftermath they don't put in the pamphlets. John Willard is dead. His property is forfeit. That's the law. Convicted of a felony, your estate is seized by the government. So who gets the ferry? The profitable, essential, river-crossing ferry. The records show that in the aftermath, the ferry rights, that lucrative piece of infrastructure, were transferred. They were given to a man named Jonathan Putnam. Let that name sit for a second. Putnam, as in Thomas Putnam, the father of one of the primary afflicted girls, Anne Putnam Jr., as in the Putnam family, who had filed more accusations than any other family in Salem. The same Putnams who owned vast tracts of land in the village, who were locked in bitter disputes with their neighbors, the nurses and the porters. The ferry, the key to economic access, passed from the dead, disgraced hands of John Willard into the hands of the most accusation-happy family in the entire story. You know, if you're still listening at this point, you're one of us. Hit subscribe. We uncover a new American mystery every single night. Draw your own conclusions. It's just a business transaction, a transfer of assets after a tragedy. Nothing to see here, just the gears of justice and commerce turning in perfect, silent unison. But John Willard's story gives us a new lens. It shows us that the terror wasn't just spiritual. It wasn't just social. It was transactional. It had a cash value, a ferry fare, a seized estate, a rerouted piece of vital infrastructure. The hysteria created a kind of violent, chaotic market, and certain people were very well positioned to profit from it. And if they could profit from a ferry, what about a tavern? A thriving business right in the heart of the village, where people talked, where rumors spread, where a proprietor might hear things she wasn't supposed to. Because next, we come to the woman who owned it. So we've seen the ferry, a crucial piece of infrastructure, a monopoly, and a man named John Alden who was accused of witchcraft but managed to slip away. It's a pattern that starts to feel less like coincidence and more like a blueprint. You follow the money, you follow the land, and you start to see the shape of the thing. Now, let's talk about the tavern. Not just any tavern. This was the Howe family tavern, and it sat right at the intersection of the road to Salem town and the road to Ipswich. Think of it as the bus station, the news hub, the watering hole, and the political nerve center for the entire village. Whoever controlled that tavern controlled the flow of information, of gossip, of business. It was a seat of real, tangible power in a world where power was measured in acres and influence. And it was owned by a woman. Her name was Bridget Bishop. Now, if you know one name from the Salem Witch Trials besides maybe the judges, it's probably Bridget Bishop. She's held up as the archetype. The flamboyant one. The one who didn't conform. The story they tell is that she wore a red bodice, a red paragon bodice, they called it, which was apparently too flashy for Puritan tastes. She was known to be sharp-tongued, a bit of a character. She'd been married 3 times, she ran a successful business, and she didn't seem to care much what the stern men of the village thought of her. In the official story, she's the perfect villain, the obvious witch. Of course, they went after her first, but stay with me here, because the official story always focuses on her personality, her red bodice. As if a piece of clothing is evidence of consorting with the devil, it's a distraction, a very convenient one. Look at the woman, not at the property she sits on. Bridget Bishop wasn't just some eccentric widow. She was, by all accounts, a formidable businesswoman. She owned that prime location tavern. And she owned a second, equally profitable tavern in Salem town itself. She had a sizable farm. She was, in the economic language of 1692, loaded, and she was independent. No husband at the time to manage her affairs. She did it herself. Now, who would want that? Who would look at a prosperous, sharp-widowed woman sitting on 2 lucrative businesses and valuable land and think, what an obstacle? The accusations against Bridget didn't come out of nowhere. They had been simmering for years. A decade earlier, she'd been accused of witchcraft by a neighbor after a dispute. Nothing came of it. But the rumor was there, dormant, like a seed in cold soil. All it needed was the right climate to sprout. And in 1692, the climate was perfect. The accusations this time were a torrent. The afflicted girls said her specter pinched them, choked them, tempted them to sign the devil's book. But listen to the other testimony. Neighbors said she appeared to them at night like a ghost. A laborer claimed he found poppets, dolls, stuck with pins in the cellar wall of her old house, a house she hadn't lived in for years. The story goes that when officials went to look, they found the poppets exactly where the man said they'd be. You'd think someone would have checked if that laborer had been in that cellar himself, right? Nobody ever asked why. Her trial was a foregone conclusion. The spectral evidence was overwhelming. Her personality was used against her. Her defiance was read as guilt. When asked if she had any idea why these girls were tormented by her shape, she reportedly said, "I am innocent to a witch. I know not what a witch is." How do you defend yourself against a crime that has no physical evidence, only the visions of your accusers? You can't. That was the point of spectral evidence. It was the perfect, unassailable weapon. On June 10, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hanged on Gallows Hill. She was the first person executed in the Salem Witch Trials. The speed of it is telling. She was arrested in April, tried, and condemned in June. They moved fast. There was an urgency to it, almost a hunger. And here's the part that should bother you. The part that shifts this from a story about hysteria to a story about cold calculation. What happened to her property? Because when you are executed for a felony in the 17th century, specifically for witchcraft, which was considered petty treason, you suffered corruption of blood. Your property was forfeit. You could not pass it on to your heirs. Everything you owned reverted to the crown. In practice, that meant it fell into the hands of the colonial government, the same government being run by the men who had just convicted you. Bridget Bishop's estate was seized, her taverns, her land, all of it. Now the records are messy. The transfer of witch land wasn't always neat and recorded in a single ledger with a sinister stamp. It was a process. It involved debts being called in, mortgages suddenly enforced, auctions where only certain people had the capital to bid. It was a quiet, legalistic dismantling of a life's work. But the result was the same. A powerful, independent woman with prime commercial property was removed, permanently. And her assets entered a new pool to be redistributed among the powerful, the connected, the men who had survived the accusation themselves or who sat in judgment. Think about the message that sent. The very first execution. Not some powerless, elderly woman on the margins, but a wealthy, central, visible pillar of the community. They made an example of Bridget Bishop. They showed everyone what happened if you stood out, if you owned too much, if you were inconvenient. And they got her tavern. So you tell me, was Bridget Bishop hanged because a group of girls had convulsions at the sight of her specter? Or was she hanged because she was a woman who owned the bus station, the pub, and the newsstand at the most important intersection in town? Was she a witch, or was she a title deed that needed to be cleared? Her death opened the floodgates. It proved the system worked. Accusation led to arrest, arrest to conviction, conviction to execution, execution to forfeiture. It was a terrible, efficient machine. And once they saw it work, the accusations began to spread. Not randomly, not in a wild, uncontrollable frenzy, but along property lines, along boundary fences, along disputed wills. The next one they came for, she didn't own a tavern. She owned something even more valuable, something that made the men on the committee for the Ferry and the men who wanted the tavern lick their lips. She owned the Riverfront itself. So we've seen the pattern, the ferryman, the tavern owner, people with property that was, let's say, inconveniently located for the ambitions of others. But now we come to a case that strips the whole operation bare. It removes any last, lingering doubt that this was about spirits and pinches and fits. This was about dirt and water. The best kind of dirt is the kind that touches water. Her name was Susanna Martin, and she lived not in Salem Village, but in Amesbury to the north. That's important. She was an outsider, a stranger to the daily dramas of the Paris household. The girls who started this had never met her. They'd never seen her before the day she was brought in. So how did she get on their radar? Well, the story goes that a man named John Allen had a problem. He was a teamster, a guy with oxen and carts who moved things for a living. And sometime before the trials, he'd entered into a business arrangement with Susanna Martin's son. It went bad. Money was lost. Words were exchanged. And John Allen, according to the later accounts, became convinced that Susanna Martin had bewitched his oxen, that she'd made them unable to pull his carts. A classic case of spectral interference, right? Blame the mysterious older woman for your own business failures. But here's where it gets weird. John Allen wasn't from Salem Village either. He was from Salisbury, another town over. So how does a property dispute? Because that's what a broken business deal over oxen really is. Between people in Amesbury and Salisbury end up as a capital case in Salem. You'd think there'd be some jurisdictional issue, right? They didn't, because the accusation was a vehicle. It got Susanna Martin into the system. Once she was in the cage in Salem, the real machinery could start, and the real accusers stepped forward. At her examination, the Salem girls put on their usual performance. They fell down, they cried out. They claimed her specter was pinching them. But Susanna Martin did something remarkable. She laughed. She looked at these contorting teenagers and she laughed right in their faces. She called it absurd. She had a sharp, dismissive wit. When one accuser said her specter had come all the way from Amesbury to torment her, Susanna shot back, "I don't know how that can be." It was a refusal to play the game, a refusal to grant their fantasy any power. In a room where everyone was treating delusion as evidence, her laughter was a revolutionary act. It was also a death sentence. They convicted her. Of course they did. But you have to ask yourself, why was she so important? She was a widow in her 70s. She was poor. She lived in a remote area. What was the prize? The prize was the Martin family farm, 60 acres in Amesbury. Now Amesbury is inland, but it sits on the Powwow River, which feeds into the mighty Merrimack. The Merrimack was the interstate highway of 17th century New England. It was the conduit for timber, for goods, for everything. Controlling land along its tributaries was like controlling an on-ramp. And the Martin land, it wasn't just any 60 acres. It was prime, old-growth timberland. We're talking about towering white pines, the exact resource the British Crown desperately wanted for ship masts for the Royal Navy. This was mast tree territory. This was gold. And Susanna Martin, a stubborn, laughing widow, owned it. Now, nobody has a signed confession from John Allen or the Putnam family or the judges saying, "We killed her for the trees." History doesn't work like that. But you follow the money. You follow the land. After Susanna Martin was hanged on July 19, 1692, what happened to that valuable river-adjacent property? It didn't go to her children. Not smoothly, anyway. The legal chaos of a witchcraft conviction, a crime against God and the state, created a fog. Titles could be contested. Debts, real or invented, could be called in. The estate could be tied up in courts for years, during which time those valuable trees could be harvested. By neighbors, by business partners, by anyone with a strong claim and a stronger axe. Stay with me here. The accusation started with a business deal gone sour over oxen in another town. It was amplified by professional accusers in Salem who had never met the woman. It was prosecuted by a court with a financial interest in convictions, and it resulted in the execution of a property-owning widow and the destabilization of her estate. Do you see the through line? It's not a straight line. It's a messy, human, greedy line. But it's there. Susanna Martin walked to the gallows. She is recorded as being pious and composed. She had spent a lifetime being suspected of witchcraft. Gossip had dogged her for years. So in a terrible way, this final act was just the official stamp on a long-running rumor. But her laughter in that courtroom echoes down the centuries. It's the sound of a person who saw the scam for what it was, even as she was caught in its gears. And here's the part that should bother you. This wasn't a secret. People knew where she lived. People knew what her land was worth. The judges who sentenced her to die were the same men granting timber licenses, adjudicating land disputes, and building commercial networks. They weren't stupid. They could read a map. They knew a mast-quality pine from a firewood-quality birch. So when a woman like Susanna Martin, with her inconvenient property and her infuriating laughter, was brought before them by this convenient new engine of spectral evidence, what did they see? A witch or an opportunity? They saw both, and that was the true horror of Salem. It wasn't that they believed in witches. It's that their belief became so terribly, profitably useful. So Susanna Martin becomes another entry in the ledger. But the operation is accelerating now. The template is proven. Accuse, convict, confiscate. And the next target would show just how brazen this could get, because they weren't just going after widows on the edges of town anymore. They were coming for one of the wealthiest, most established men in the entire region. A man who wouldn't just lose a woodlot, he'd lose an empire. And all it would take was a single, well-placed accusation from a young girl. So you've got the pattern now. The Ferry owner, the tavern keeper, the woman with the prime riverfront parcel. They were taken out of the picture. But the operation, the real machinery of it, didn't run on grand, sweeping gestures. It ran on the small, quiet, devastatingly efficient mechanism of the law. And in 1692, in Salem, the law had a very specific tool for transferring property from one person to another. It was called an attainder. Now, an attainder is a legal ghost. We don't really have them anymore. But back then, if you were convicted of a felony and witchcraft was a felony, a capital crime, you were attainted. It's a heavy, final word. It means you are legally dead. Your blood is corrupted. You cannot own property. You cannot pass anything on to your heirs. Everything you have, every acre, every cow, every spoon is forfeit to the crown, or, in this case, to the colonial government. But here's the part that should bother you. In a normal felony case, you'd be convicted, then executed, and then your property would be formally seized. The process took time. There were documents, inventories, sheriff's sales. It was messy, public. It left a paper trail. What happened in Salem was different. They streamlined it. They turned the legal process into a conveyor belt. A person would be accused. They'd be arrested and sent to jail, not a local jail, but a prison in Boston, miles away. They were removed from the community, from anyone who might speak for them. Then the court would convene. Spectral evidence would be presented. A verdict of guilty would be handed down. And then, almost immediately, the court would issue a writ of attainder. The legal death of the person happened before the physical death, sometimes weeks before. Why does that matter? It matters because the moment you are attainted, you no longer own your farm. It's not yours. You're just a ghost waiting to be hanged, living on land that now belongs to the government. And a vacant, government-owned farm is a lot easier to redistribute than one owned by a living, breathing, troublesome neighbor who might cause a fuss. Let's follow one farm through this process. Take George Jacobs SR. He was old, he used 2 canes to walk. He was irascible, blunt, not a man who suffered fools, and he owned a sizable, well-situated farm. He was accused. His own servant girl and eventually his granddaughter testified against him. He was hauled off to Boston. The court found him guilty. The attainder was signed. His farm, every stick and stone of it, now belonged to the colony. But the colony wasn't some abstract entity. It was run by men who lived in Salem and in Boston, men who had friends, cousins, business partners, men who understood the value of good land. Now, what happens to forfeited property? It gets sold. The proceeds are supposed to go to the crown, but the costs get deducted first. The cost of the prisoner's imprisonment, the cost of the trial, the cost of the executioner, the feed for the horses that transported the prisoner. Every single bureaucratic expense is tallied up and charged against the value of the estate. By the time the crown gets its theoretical share, there's often nothing left. The money has all been consumed by the very process that created it, but someone still gets the land. The land doesn't vanish. It's sold at auction to settle those costs. And who shows up at those auctions? You don't see poor farmers from the next county over. You see local men with ready cash, associates of the judges, relatives of the accusers. The same tight circle of families who were driving the accusations in the first place. George Jacobs was hanged on August 19, 1692, but his farm was already gone from him the moment the court clerk's pen scratched that attainder. The physical hanging was almost a formality. The real work was done. The asset had been liquidated, and this is where the operation reveals its cold, bureaucratic heart. This wasn't a frenzied mob burning down a house and seizing the land. That's messy. That leaves you open to a counterattack, to a claim of restitution later. This was cleaner. This used the official seals, the court orders, the sheriff's inventory. It wrapped the whole bloody business in the respectable parchment of the law. You weren't stealing a farm. You were settling the debts of a convicted felon. You were performing a civic duty, even. You were helping to defray the costs of justice. Nobody ever asked why the costs of justice seem to always add up to exactly the value of the most desirable properties. Stay with me here. Because this legal machinery created a perverse incentive that started to feed on itself. At first, maybe it was about a specific plot of land. Get rid of the Ferry owner, and his nephew, who's been cozy with the judges, gets the lucrative crossing rights. But once the system proved it worked, once you saw that you could point a finger, get a man removed, and then have his property appear, neat and tidy, at a sheriff's sale, the temptation must have been overwhelming. It wasn't just about old grudges anymore. It was about futures. It was about legacy. A farm for your son, a pasture for your herds, a woodlot for your timber. The accusations began to spiral because the mechanism for rewarding them was now in place, polished and efficient. It created its own gravity. The more people you sent through the process, the more property became available. The more property that became available, the more people wanted a piece of it, and the more accusations you needed to keep the pipeline full. You'd think someone would have noticed, right? All these prosperous, property-holding people being picked off, and their estates flowing to the same small network of families. And some people did. We know they did. Because as the summer of 1692 wore on, the accusations began to hit a wall. They started to move up the social ladder toward people whose property was so vast, so interconnected with the power structure of the entire colony, that seizing it would cause a political earthquake. When accusations touched the family of the governor himself, the gears of the machine suddenly began to grind. But for those few hot months, the conveyor belt ran smoothly. Accuse, arrest, attain, auction. It was a perfect, closed loop. A person went in one end and a vacant, title-cleared farm came out the other. And that brings us to the most chilling question of all. If you're a neighbor watching this happen, what do? You see a man taken away. You see his farm inventoried by the sheriff. You see it sold at auction to a magistrate's cousin. You know in your bones what's happening. But to speak out is to risk stepping onto that conveyor belt yourself. So you stay quiet. You tend your own fields. You hope the hunger of the machine is satisfied with the farms it has already consumed. But what if your farm is better? What if your pasture is richer, your orchard more productive? What if you've had a dispute over a boundary line with the wrong person? You start to look at your own neighbors differently, and they start to look at you. Because in the summer of 1692, the fastest way to lose your farm wasn't a poor harvest or a bad investment. It was the man living next door. So you've got the pattern now. The tavern, the ferry, the prime riverfront farm. Accuse, convict, seize. A tidy little system. But systems, especially ones this brutal, require operators. They need people willing to do the dirty work, to point the finger, to stand up in that crowded meeting house and say the words that will send a neighbor to the gallows and their property to the auction block. And here's where it gets personal. We've talked about the accusers as a group, the afflicted girls. But they were the spark, not the torch. The torch was carried by their families, their fathers and uncles, the grown men who had grievances to settle and land to acquire. This wasn't a children's crusade. It was a hostile takeover, and the adults were driving. Think about your neighbor. The one whose fence line has always been a subject of quiet dispute. The one whose cows always seem to get into your corn. The one who owns that beautiful, sunny pasture right next to your own rocky, tree-choked lot. You've made offers to buy it. He's refused. For years, there's bad blood. Maybe you've sued him over something petty and he won. Maybe he testified against you in a court case. The resentment simmers. Then, in the spring of 1692, your daughter or your niece or your servant girl starts having fits. She names names. And suddenly you have a weapon. A righteous, godly, unassailable weapon. You'd think someone would have noticed the coincidence, right? That the fits always seem to align so perfectly with daddy's property disputes. But when a girl is screaming that she's being pinched by invisible hands, it's hard to stand up and say, "Now hold on, didn't her father lose a lawsuit to that man last year?" That sounds cynical. That sounds like you're siding with the devil. So the operation begins. You encourage the accusations. You might not even see it as encouragement. You ask leading questions. Is it Goody Proctor who torments you? When you know full well your neighbor just sold a parcel to John Proctor. You make sure the magistrates hear about every past slight, every argument, framing it not as a quarrel between men, but as evidence of the accused's malicious, witch-like nature. That lawsuit he won against you, proof of his diabolical influence over the proceedings, his refusal to sell you that pasture, clearly the work of a covetous, envious spirit, the textbook sin of a witch. The court records are full of this. They're not just records of spectral pinches and phantom yellow birds. They're transcripts of old grudges. You read them and you see it. A man being accused, and then a parade of neighbors taking the stand to recount, not supernatural events, but every petty argument, every business deal gone sour, every boundary line dispute from the last 20 years. And it's all presented as background, as character evidence for why this person is capable of witchcraft. Now this is the part nobody talks about, the actual mechanics of the grab. Let's say your plan works, your neighbor is arrested, he's thrown in jail. Here's the immediate problem: a farm in 1692 isn't a stock portfolio, it's a living thing. The cows need milking, the fields need sowing, the fences need mending. If the owner is in a Boston dungeon who manages it, the law had an answer. The sheriff would seize the property for the king. But the king wasn't coming to Salem to milk the cows. The property needed a custodian. And who better to serve as custodian than the accuser, the righteous man who helped root out the evil in the community? You'd be appointed to manage the estate, to preserve it, for a fee, of course. So now you're on your neighbor's farm, you're collecting his harvest, you're selling his livestock, you're living in his house. The legal process grinds on, but you're already in possession. And possession, as they say, is 9/10 of the law, but what if he's acquitted? A dangerous thought. It happened, rarely, but it happened. If he comes back, he'll want his farm back, and he'll know exactly what you did. This is where the operation tightens its grip. An acquittal couldn't be allowed. The spectral evidence, that flimsy, unprovable testimony about invisible shapes, becomes the linchpin. Because how do you defend against it? You can't. If the girls say your specter is biting them, and they show a bite mark, your real, physical body in a jail cell 50 miles away is no alibi. The system was designed to produce convictions. And here's the part that should bother you. The greed wasn't even hidden. It was documented. After an execution, the sheriff would inventory the deceased's property, sell it at auction, and use the proceeds to cover the costs of the trial and the imprisonment. That's right. The accused had to pay for their own shackles, their own jail food, the cost of the guards who watched them. If you were hanged, your estate paid for the rope, the gallows construction, the executioner's fee. If you died in prison, your estate paid for your board up until your death. They itemized it. 2 expenses for the trial of Goody Nurse, followed by a list of charges. It was a billing. The final, grotesque invoice for your life sent to your grieving family. If the estate didn't cover the costs, and the costs were often inflated, the town could levy the difference on the remaining family, driving them into debt and forcing them to sell off the rest. It was financial annihilation. So the neighbor who suddenly wanted your pasture didn't just get you hanged. He got you to pay for the privilege. He got the community to foot the bill for his land grab, all under the solemn cover of legal and religious duty. The operation was self-funding. The more people it consumed, the more resources it generated to consume more. And this machine, once built, developed a hunger of its own. It couldn't be turned off just because one man got his pasture. There were too many people invested in its continued operation. The jailers, the court officers, the magistrates drawing fees, and all the other neighbors with their own eyes on a coveted piece of land, a better woodlot, a more productive orchard. Stay with me here. Because a machine this efficient, this profitable, doesn't limit its appetite. It starts to look for more fuel, and if it's run out of easy targets on the outskirts of the village, where does it look next? It looks toward the center. Toward the biggest houses, the most powerful names, the people who thought they were running the show. Because the truly frightening thing about a witch hunt isn't when it targets the outsiders. It's when it turns on the insiders. When the pastor's wife starts looking at the girls trembling in the pews, and wonders, with a cold dread, if her name will be next. The governor's wife gets named, and that changes everything. So the accusations have been working like a charm, a well-oiled machine. You have a problem neighbor, a piece of land you've been eyeing, a business rival on the wharf. Just whisper the word. Witch. And the court, that special court of oyer and terminer, would do the rest. It was a perfect, self-perpetuating system. The accusers got what they wanted. The judges got to be heroes purging the colony of evil, and the ministers got to preach about the end times. Everyone's interests were aligned. But every system has a pressure point, a limit. A line that once crossed makes the whole operation suddenly inconvenient for the men in charge. And that line had a name, Lady Mary Phipps. Now you need to understand who her husband was, Sir William Phipps, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He'd been off in Maine for most of the summer, fighting a war against the French and their native allies. He was a man of action, a treasure hunter who'd found a sunken Spanish galleon, a political appointee from London. He wasn't steeped in the local theology of Salem Village. He was an administrator. And while he was away, he'd left the witch problem in the hands of his deputy, Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, the same William Stoughton who was the Chief Justice of that special witch court, the one signing the death warrants. So the machine kept running. Through the spring, through the summer. The accusations spread out from Salem Village into Salem Town, into Ipswich, Andover, even up to Boston itself. The net was cast wider and wider, and the people it began to catch were of a different social caliber. We're not talking about outspoken women with riverfront property anymore. We're talking about the merchant class, the wealthy, the well-connected. And then in late September of 1692, it happened. According to later accounts, the accusers, those afflicted girls, were brought to Boston, to the home of a wealthy merchant. And in that house, in front of witnesses, they fell into their fits. They pointed their trembling fingers, and they named the source of their torment, the governor's wife, Lady Mary Phipps. You have to picture the scene for a moment. The gasps, the sudden, cold silence that would have followed the screaming. The girls writhing on a fine, imported rug, pointing at the most powerful woman in the colony. The wife of the man who technically outranked everyone in the room. The deputy governor, Stoughton, would have been there. The other judges, probably. Their own weapon, the accusation, had just been turned on the hand that fed the court its authority. Now, the official records of this accusation are thin, suspiciously thin. The court papers from that period are a mess, but you'd think an accusation against the governor's wife would leave a bigger paper trail. It doesn't. It survives mostly in letters, in later histories, in the kind of documents that record what everyone knew but nobody wrote down officially. The story goes that the girls later recanted, saying they'd been mistaken, that a different witch had taken Lady Phipps's shape. But the damage was done. The line had been crossed. Think about what this meant for William Stoughton and the court. Up until this moment, the hysteria had been useful. It consolidated their power. It removed obstacles. It made them the defenders of the faith. But accusing the governor's wife, that wasn't removing an obstacle. That was creating a catastrophic political problem. Sir William Phipps was due back from the frontier any day. How were they going to explain to him that his own court had entertained, even for a second, the idea that his wife was a witch? That she'd been publicly named by the very girls whose testimony they'd been using to hang people. You'd think someone would have seen this coming. The accusations were always about power, and power has a hierarchy. The girls, or whoever was guiding them, had been working their way up the social ladder, testing the limits. First the poor, then the middling sort, then the prosperous. Each successful accusation proved the system worked and emboldened them to aim higher. It was a logical progression, but logic doesn't always account for raw political survival. So why did the girls do it? That's the question that hangs over this moment. Were they so deep in their own performance, so convinced of their own narrative, that they didn't understand the political reality? Or was it a deliberate power play? A message: we are not afraid of anyone. Our authority, our spectral sight, is above even the governor. Or, and this is the darker possibility, was it a miscalculation by whoever might have been feeding them names and grievances? Maybe a local rival of the governor saw an opening. Maybe someone thought they could topple the whole administration. We'll never know for sure, but we know what happened next. The reaction was immediate and decisive. The accusation against Lady Phipps was shut down. Hard. No warrant was issued. No examination was scheduled. The girls were persuaded that they had made a mistake. The incident was contained, but you can't unring a bell. The governor was about to return to a colony where his own wife had been publicly branded a witch. And the Chief Justice of the Witch Court, his own deputy, had been presiding over the circus that allowed it to happen. The political alliance between Phipps and Stoughton, which the witch trials depended upon, was now cracked. This is the turning point. The moment the Hysteria stopped being a tool for the powerful and started being a threat to the powerful. Up until now, the accused were people whose loss could be absorbed or even benefited from. Their land could be seized, their silence enforced, their businesses redistributed. But Lady Mary Phipps, her loss couldn't be absorbed. It would mean the collapse of the colonial government itself. So the machine had to be stopped, not out of mercy. Not out of a sudden realization that spectral evidence was nonsense, but out of sheer, pragmatic self-preservation. The operation had finally hit a target it could not afford to destroy. And that's when Sir William Phipps rode back into Boston. He returned to a colony in the grip of the panic he'd left in Stoughton's hands. He returned to a jail crammed with over 100 accused witches. He returned to a stack of death warrants with more on the way. And he returned to the whispered story about his own wife. A story everyone knew and nobody would say out loud to his face. He had a decision to make, and it wouldn't be about truth or justice or the invisible world. It would be about power, pure and simple. The question was no longer, who is a witch? The question became, how do I shut this down without destroying my own authority? He would make his move within weeks. A move that would dismantle the court but leave its work and its judges strangely untouched. Because in the world of power, you sometimes have to stop the game, but you never, ever punish the players, not the important ones. And that decision, that political calculation made in a governor's mansion in Boston, is what finally brought the hangings to an end. Not conscience, not evidence, convenience, which makes you wonder, what if his wife had never been named? How many more pastures, how many more Ferry rights, how many more prime lots on the Ipswich Road would have changed hands before someone finally said, enough? But someone did say enough, because the wrong person's name finally came up. And that's when the real magic happened, the magic of political survival. It made 100 spectral accusations vanish into thin air. So the governor's wife gets named. You remember that. The accusation against Lady Phipps, the governor's own wife, lands in the middle of this whole mess like a lit fuse in a powder keg. And suddenly, the entire atmosphere in Salem, and more importantly, in Boston, shifts. The hysteria, which had been this unstoppable force, this perfect machine for settling scores and grabbing land, it just became inconvenient for the right people. Because here's the thing about systems of control. They work beautifully as long as they're aimed at the people who don't have any. The poor, the outspoken, the widows with good land and no male protector. The system isn't designed to turn on its operators. The moment it does, the operators find the off switch, and they find it very, very quickly. The accusation against Lady Phipps happened in late 1692. By then, over 150 people had been accused. 20 had been executed. Dozens more were rotting in jail, their farms already being divided up or tended by neighbors who'd testified against them. The machine was humming, but accusing the governor's wife. That wasn't just a misfire. That was the machine trying to consume itself. It showed the elite, in the starkest terms possible, that this thing had no built-in limits. If a girl's spectral vision could point to a tavern keeper's widow, it could point to a merchant's daughter. If it could condemn a ferry owner, it could condemn a judge. And if it could name the governor's wife, well, who was next? The governor himself, the judges on the court, the wealthy Boston merchants who'd been quietly benefiting from the chaos. You'd think someone would have noticed this risk earlier, right? That someone would have said, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't let teenage girls send anyone to the gallows based on a dream." But they didn't. Not until the dream pointed up the social ladder instead of across the fence line. Governor William Phipps now had a personal, immediate problem. His own wife was in the crosshairs, and his problem, by extension, became the problem of every powerful man who'd allowed this to happen. The political calculus changed overnight. It was no longer about rooting out the devil in Massachusetts. It was about containing a legal and social disaster that was now threatening to burn down the governor's own house. So Phipps did what any pragmatic politician does. He moved to protect the institution and himself. He didn't immediately shut everything down. That would look like an admission of guilt, like he was stopping the trials just to save his wife. No, he took a more bureaucratic route. He suspended the special court of Oyer and Terminer, the one that had been running the show, the one that accepted spectral evidence. He didn't disband it. He suspended it. In October of 1692. He cited publicly the growing doubts about the use of spectral evidence. The concerns raised by men like the Reverend we talked about earlier, the ones who'd been shouting into the wind for months. Their arguments, once ignored, were now suddenly very persuasive to the governor. Convenient, that. But here's the part that should bother you. The accusations didn't stop. The jails were still full. People were still being named. The land grab mechanism was still primed. Phipps had stopped the main engine, but the smaller gears were still turning. He needed a way to drain the swamp without admitting it was all a poisoned well. So he did something clever. He let the existing legal system, the one that had been sidelined for this special panic, slowly reassert itself. He transferred power to the regular courts, and he issued a series of proclamations that, piece by piece, deflated the entire affair. First, he forbade any new arrests for witchcraft, just like that. The accusers could point and shriek all they wanted, but the constables wouldn't be coming. That took the immediate terror away. Then he started ordering the release of those already in jail, but not a grand proclamation of innocence. No, he did it through bonds. People could be released if they posted a bond for their good behavior. It was a face-saving measure. It didn't say the trials were wrong. It just said we're moving on. And of course, if you were a poor farmer whose land had already been seized, who was going to post your bond? The neighbor who testified against you. Unlikely. The most telling move, though, was what happened to the accusers. Almost overnight, they lost their power. Their fits and visions, which had been treated as gospel for months, were now being dismissed. When they tried to accuse new people, they were ignored. When they had fits in court, they were told to be quiet. The social permission that had been granted to them was abruptly revoked. The script had been rewritten, and they hadn't gotten the new pages. Now, this is the part nobody talks about. What do you do with a hysteria machine once you've decided to turn it off? You can't just say, oops. You have to manage the aftermath, and the management here was selective. The wealthy, the connected, the people with influential friends, they got out of jail. Their bonds were paid. They slowly, quietly tried to reclaim what was left of their lives. But the poor, the marginalized, many of them remained in jail for months more because they couldn't pay. They'd lost everything. Their farms were gone. Their livestock was sold. Their names were ruined. A bond wasn't freedom. It was just another financial barrier they couldn't cross. And what about the accusers? The girls and young women who'd been the engine of this. They faded from the record. No punishment. No real scrutiny. A few years later, one of them, Ann Putnam Jr., would issue a public confession in her church, saying she'd been deluded by the devil. It was a performative act of closure for the community. But it didn't bring back the dead. It didn't return the land. The moment the hysteria became inconvenient, the powerful did what they always do. They insulated themselves. They changed the rules. They created a bureaucratic off-ramp. They never admitted it was all a grotesque fraud from the start. Because to admit that would mean admitting they'd murdered 20 people for their property. It would mean admitting they'd destroyed countless lives out of greed and fear. It was far easier to say, we were earnest, but perhaps we relied too heavily on a certain kind of evidence. The devil is cunning. And then move on. But the land, the deeds that had changed hands, the pastures that were now part of someone else's farm, the riverfront lots that now had new owners, those didn't get a suspension. Those didn't get a bond for good behavior. Those transfers stood. The court might have been stopped, but the thefts it enabled were made permanent. The panic ended when it threatened the wrong person, but the spoils of that panic were quietly kept. So the governor saved his wife. And in doing so, he pulled the plug. But the water didn't drain evenly. The people at the top climbed out, wet and shaken but intact. The people at the bottom, they were left to drown in the consequences. And with the special court suspended, with the accusers silenced, with the jail cells slowly emptying, Massachusetts now had a new problem. What do you do with a broken justice system? How do you govern after you've let the town hang its neighbors on a whim? You convene a new court, but this one has a very different task. Not to find more witches, but to clean up the mess and make sure the right story gets written down. So the governor's wife gets named, and the whole machine, the entire fever dream of a court, just stops. It wasn't an immediate thing. There was no grand announcement, no public apology. The court of oyer and terminer, the court to hear and determine, simply stopped hearing. And it stopped determining. Governor Phipps, the man who had created this special court in the first place, who had let it run wild for months, now found himself in a very personal, very dangerous position. His own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, had been accused. The hysteria, which had been such a useful tool for so long, had finally turned and bitten the hand that fed it. You have to understand, this wasn't a moral awakening. This was a political emergency. The operation had become a liability. Phipps did what any savvy politician does when a project goes sideways. He didn't end it. He distanced himself from it. In late October of 1692, he wrote a letter back to his superiors in England. The tone of that letter is a masterpiece of bureaucratic deflection. He talks about the great number of guilty persons still awaiting trial, but then he mentions, almost as an aside, the many difficulties that have arisen, the great and just dissatisfaction of the people. He writes that he's put a stop to the proceedings. He dissolves the court of Oyer and Terminer. He says he's waiting for further advice. He's washing his hands of it, but he's doing it quietly. Because think about what he's admitting by shutting it down. If the court was legitimate, if the evidence was sound, why disband it? Why not just replace a few judges and carry on? To stop now is to imply that everything that came before, the 19 hangings, the one pressing, the dozens imprisoned, the families ruined, was a mistake. Or worse. So you don't say that. You just let the court fade away. And that's exactly what happened. There was no final session. No gavel coming down for the last time. The judges, Stoughton, Sewell, the rest just stopped showing up to the makeshift courtrooms. The jailers were told not to bring any more prisoners for trial. The spectral evidence, that ridiculous cornerstone of the entire prosecution, was suddenly, informally, ruled inadmissible. Without it, the cases collapsed. They had to. You can't convict someone of witchcraft because a teenage girl says she saw their ghost milking a cow. Not when the governor's social circle is in the crosshairs. Now, this is the part nobody talks about. What happened to the people still in the dungeons? The ones who hadn't been tried yet or who had been convicted but not yet executed. They just stayed there, in the cold, in the filth. The court was gone, but the machinery of imprisonment kept grinding. William Stoughton, the Chief Justice, was furious. He'd signed the death warrants. He believed in the work. To him, stopping was an act of cowardice. He wanted to finish the job, but Phipps had taken away his gavel. So winter sets in. 1692 becomes 1693. And the public mood, which had been a roaring fire, is now just cold ash and regret. People are starting to look at their neighbors differently. That pasture you coveted, that riverfront lot you testified against your neighbor to get, it's still in your possession, but now everyone knows how you got it. The greed is still there, but it's covered by a thin layer of shame. And in the jail, people are dying. Not from the gallows, but from disease, from malnutrition, from the sheer brutal conditions of a 17th century prison in winter. Phipps had to do something. He couldn't just leave them all to rot. So in January, he finally authorizes a new court, a superior court of judicature. Sounds official, right? But the rules have changed. The new Chief Justice is Stoughton, though he's still on the bench, glaring from the sidelines. And the new rule is simple, no spectral evidence. None. You need real, tangible proof. And of course, in cases of witchcraft, there never is any. The new court meets in Salem in January. They try 52 people, and they convict 3, only 3. And then Phipps steps in again. He pardons those 3. He pardons everyone. By May, it's over. The jail doors are creaking open. The survivors are stumbling out, blinking in the sunlight, free but utterly broken. Their farms are gone. Their livestock is gone. Their reputations are poison. Some try to return to their land, only to find new families living there, families with freshly inked deeds. They're ghosts in their own hometown. And here's the part that should bother you, the aftermath. Or really, the lack of one. There's no investigation, no commission to find out what went wrong. No judges are removed from office. No accusers are charged with perjury or murder. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, would stand in church years later and have a note of confession read aloud. A single, somber moment, but that's it. For most of them, life just went on. William Stoughton, the most zealous of the judges, would later become the acting governor of Massachusetts. He never expressed a single regret, not one. The operation was complete. The land had changed hands. The old power structures, those troublesome, independent-minded women, those men who owned the Ferry, the Tavern, the prime acreage, had been dismantled. And the men who did it, they kept their jobs, they kept their power, they kept the respect of the community. The story was allowed to become one of mass hysteria, of a tragic error, of the devil working in mysterious ways. A story where no one was really to blame. That's the story that gets written down. That's the story that gets taught. You know, if you're still listening at this point, you're one of us. Hit subscribe. We uncover a new American mystery every single night. But the land deeds don't lie. And the dates on those deeds tell a very specific, very quiet story. The court disbanded. The prisoners were freed. But the property never went back. So the gallows were quiet. The jail was empty. And in the sudden, awkward silence that followed, you could hear the sound of something else. The scratch of pens on parchment. The closing of ledger books. The soft thud of a deed being filed away in a new chest. Because the trials were over, but the transactions were just beginning. So the court is disbanded. The governor steps in. The special court of Oyer and Terminer is officially dissolved in October of 1692. The spectral evidence is thrown out. The remaining accused, the ones still alive in the jails, begin to be released on bail. The storm officially is over. But a storm leaves things behind. It leaves debris. It leaves changed landscapes. And it leaves people standing in the wreckage, looking around, trying to figure out what just happened and what's left. This is where we have to look past the gallows, past the hysterical girls, past the sermons and the specters, because the machinery of the trials didn't just stop. It had momentum. And that momentum carried forward into something very quiet, very legal, and very permanent property. You remember the pattern we traced. The accusations that seemed to follow property lines, the neighbor who wanted a pasture, the man who owned the ferry, the woman with the prime riverfront, the tavern owner. We saw how the accusation was the key that turned the lock. But what happened after the lock clicked open? The trials ended, but the transfers of land, those were just getting started. Think about the legal reality. A person is accused of witchcraft. They are arrested. Their estate is essentially frozen. They can't sell it. They can't will it. If they're a woman, especially a widow, her control over it vanishes the moment the constable takes her away. She's in a cell, awaiting a trial that might end at the gallows. And while she's there, bills pile up. There were jail fees, the cost of her own imprisonment, food such as it was, the sheriff's fees, the cost of the chains if she was put in irons. It sounds grotesque, and it was. The prisoner had to pay for the privilege of their own captivity, and if they couldn't pay, the sheriff could seize property to cover the debt. It was a perfect, self-funding system of confiscation. Now, let's say you're a widow like Martha Carrier. You're hanged in August. You're gone. But your children aren't. They're still there. And according to the law at the time, a convicted felon's property was forfeit. Their heirs could be cut off entirely. For witchcraft, a crime against God and the state, the taint was considered to extend to the bloodline. So your farm, that fertile land you worked, it's now in legal limbo. It's vulnerable. And here's where the vultures circled, but they wore the suits of lawyers and magistrates. They didn't need torches and pitchforks anymore. They had quills and ledger books. Take the case of George Jacobs, S.R. The old man was hanged. After his execution, the sheriff simply took his property. He seized it for the colony. Jacobs' own son, George Jacobs, Jr., had to petition the government to get his father's estate back. He had to prove his father's innocence posthumously, and even then, it was a fight. The land was already in the hands of the state, and the state is never in a hurry to give things back. But the most telling transactions aren't the seizures. They're the sales, the desperate, forced sales made by the accused who survived. Imagine you're John Proctor. You're not the fictional hero. You're the real man. You're in jail. You've been condemned to hang. Your wife is condemned. You are utterly ruined. You need money right now for a last-ditch legal effort, for food, for anything. What's your most liquid asset? Your land. In March of 1693, while the legal aftermath was still churning, a parcel of John Proctor's substantial farmland was sold. The buyer, none other than Sheriff George Corwin, the same Sheriff Corwin who had arrested Proctor, who had overseen his imprisonment, and who was, at that very moment, responsible for the jail fees Proctor owed. It's a conflict of interest so glaring it's hard to look at directly. The man profiting from the fees is also buying the land sold to pay those fees. You'd think someone would have cried foul, right? But who? The Proctors were dead. The community was shattered, exhausted, and deeply complicit, and Sheriff Corwin wasn't done. He did the same thing with the estate of Giles Corey. You remember Giles, the old man who was pressed to death with stones for refusing to enter a plea. By refusing to plead, he technically died before being convicted of a felony. This was a brutal, deliberate act of sacrifice. Under English law, if you died before conviction, your property could still pass to your heirs. Corey chose to be crushed over 3 days to save his farm for his sons-in-law. It was the ultimate defiance. So what does Sheriff Corwin do? He goes after Corey's heirs anyway. He claims the family owes £50 for expenses. For what exactly? The cost of the stones. The manpower to pile them on the old man, we don't know, but he strong-arms them, he threatens, and in the end he extracts a payment. He doesn't get the land, but he drains the estate of a huge sum of money. He monetized the torture. This is the part that should bother you. The hysteria provided the cover, the initial spark. But the aftermath was administered with cold, bureaucratic precision. It wasn't a mob grabbing torches from the barn. It was a sheriff with a writ. It was magistrates signing papers. It was the normal, grinding machinery of the law being used to finish what the panic started. And it worked. Look at the map of Salem Village after 1693. The property lines shifted. Land that had been in one family for generations suddenly belonged to a new name. Often a name that had been on the accusers' side of the ledger. The Putnam family, so prolific with accusations, found their landholdings significantly expanded in the years that followed. This isn't speculation, it's in the deeds. The paper trail doesn't lie. So the community is left with this. Not just ghosts and grief, but a tangible, physical redistribution of wealth. Your neighbor is gone, their family is broken, and you're now plowing their north field. How do you live with that? You tell yourself it was God's will. You tell yourself the court was just. You tell yourself you got a fair price for that distressed property. You bury the truth under layers of scripture and legal justification because the alternative is to admit you participated in or benefited from a monstrous crime. And the men who orchestrated this, the judges, the sheriffs, the ministers who fueled the flames, what happened to them? Most of them just went on with their lives. They kept their positions. They kept their reputations. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, would later issue a public apology, but that was years off. In the immediate aftermath, there was no grand reckoning, no commissions of truth and reconciliation. There was just a slow, awkward silence, a collective agreement to not look too closely at the deeds filed at the county registry. The bodies were buried in shallow graves. The land titles were recorded in perfect, permanent script. One was an ugly secret. The other was the official record. But you can't bury all the guilt, and you can't silence all the survivors. Because while the powerful moved on, the families of the dead were still there. They were pariahs. They were impoverished. And they wanted something more than just their father's farm back. They wanted their names back. That fight, the fight over memory, over legacy, over a simple admission of wrong, would take decades. It would pit broken families against the established powers of the colony. And it would reveal one last, cold truth, that for the people in charge, saying sorry was somehow harder than hanging an innocent woman. Because an apology isn't just words, it's an admission. And an admission can have consequences, even, perhaps especially, when it comes 50 years too late. So the court is gone. The gallows are quiet. The land deals, as we saw, are done. The fever breaks. And in the cold light of a Massachusetts morning, with 19 people buried in shallow graves and one man pressed to death under stones, what do? You get very, very quiet. For a while, nobody says anything at all. The accusers stop accusing. The judges stop judging. The ministers, who had been so eager to interpret every twitch as a sign from hell, suddenly find other things to talk about. It's as if the entire village wakes up from the same bad dream and agrees without a word to never mention it again. But you can't bury 20 people and just move on. Not really. The ground is haunted now. And the families left behind, the husbands, the sons, the daughters of the hanged, they're still there. Walking past the farms that used to be theirs, seeing new faces in the windows of the tavern their mother built. They are living, breathing reminders of what was done and what was taken. So the silence becomes its own kind of noise, a heavy, guilty weight. And into that silence, 5 years later, comes a sound nobody expected, an apology. In 1697, Samuel Sewall stands up in his church. Now, Sewall wasn't some minor player. He was one of the judges. He sat on that court of oyer and terminer. He sent people to the gallows based on spectral evidence he later knew was nonsense. He helped create the machine, and he helped run it. He asks the minister to read a statement, a confession. He takes the blame and shame of the proceedings upon himself. He asks for the prayers of the congregation. He asks God's pardon. And he says his hope is that he will be forgiven both in this world and the next. Think about that for a second. A judge, a powerful man. In a culture built on authority and certainty, he stands up and says in front of everyone, "I was wrong, I am sorry." It's a staggering moment. It really is. But here's the part that should bother you. It's 1697. The trials ended in 1693. What took so long? 5 years of silence. 5 years where the widows of Salem begged for the names of their husbands to be cleared, for their property rights to be restored, and got nothing but official shrugs. 5 years where the land titles, now in new hands, settled and hardened into something like permanence. You see, an apology is one thing, justice is another. Sewall's apology was personal. It was about his soul. It was, in the Puritan framework, the most important thing he could do, make his peace with God. But it did nothing for Martha Corey's son, who couldn't get her farm back. It did nothing for Giles Corey's heirs, who were still dispossessed. The apology addressed the spiritual crime. It carefully sidestepped the material one. And Sewall wasn't alone. Not long after, 12 of the jurors signed their own confession. They wrote that they were, quote, sadly deluded and mistaken. They said they feared they had been instrumental with others, though ignorantly and unwittingly, to bring upon ourselves and this people of the Lord the guilt of innocent blood. Ignorantly and unwittingly. Those are the key words. They're asking for forgiveness because they didn't know. They were tricked. They were part of a terrible mistake. Now this is the part nobody talks about. That word, mistake. Lets everyone off the hook for the other part, the greed, the ambition, the long-standing neighborly grudges that just happen to get resolved with a noose. Calling it a mass delusion, a hysteria, a tragic error, it washes away the motive. It turns calculated theft into a symptom of a shared psychosis. And isn't that convenient? Because if it was just a madness that swept through, then nobody is personally responsible for the outcomes. The land just changed hands during the confusion, a tragic side effect. But what if it wasn't a side effect? What if it was the point? The court clerk, a man named Stephen Sewell, Samuel's brother, by the way, he never apologized. Neither did Sheriff George Corwin, the man who seized all that property, who chained people in dungeons and presided over the pressing of Giles Corey. The ones who handled the logistics, the paperwork, the physical transfer of assets, they stayed quiet. In 1702, the pressure kept building. The General Court, that's the Massachusetts legislature, finally declared the trials illegal. They called them a great hardship and injury to the families. But declaring something illegal after the fact is like putting a bandage on a scar. The damage is already set. The declaration didn't order any land returned. It didn't pay restitution. It was a legal footnote. Then, in 1706, comes another performance. One of the original accusers, a woman named Ann Putnam Jr., stands in the Salem Village Church. She was a girl of 12 during the trials. She de-accused dozens. Now, as a woman of 26, she asks for membership in the very church whose members she helped send to the gallows. And to do that, she needs to confess. The minister reads her statement. She talks about being an instrument for the accusing of several persons. She says she was deluded by Satan. She begs for forgiveness. She specifically asks the pardon of the dead, though she doesn't name them, and she asks the pardon of their relatives. The church accepts her confession. They welcome her in. Now put yourself in the seat of a surviving relative. Rebecca Nurse's son, John Proctor's widow. You're sitting in that meeting house. You hear this. What do you feel? Is it closure, or is it just salt in a wound that never healed? She gets her peace. She gets her community back. Your mother, your father, your wife, they're still in an unmarked grave. Their name is still stained. Their legacy is still someone else's farm. The apologies kept coming, but they were always spiritual. They were always about the state of the soul. The community needed to heal its conscience. And the way you heal a Puritan conscience is through public confession, through humility before God. But what about the fields? What about the deeds? What about the wharves and the tavern licenses? Nobody stood up in church and said, I coveted my neighbor's pasture, and so I pointed a finger, and now I will give it back. That confession never happened. The land stayed where it was. The new owners, many of them connected to the accusers or the court officials, built their lives upon it. Their children inherited it. The roots grew deep. So you have this strange, two-layered aftermath. On the surface, a series of profound public acts of contrition. Judges and jurors and accusers all admitting a terrible wrong. It looks like accountability. It sounds like closure. But just beneath that surface, in the hard soil of Massachusetts, a silence of a different kind. A legal and financial silence. No reversals, no restitution. The material gains of the panic were allowed to stand, permanent and unchallenged. The community forgave itself for the murder. It never quite got around to addressing the theft. And that, right there, is the real legacy. The apologies came. But they came too late for the dead, and they were crafted in a way that was useless to the living. They cleansed souls, but they cemented claims. They made it possible for Salem and for history to remember the tragedy while quietly forgetting the transaction. But the families of the dead, they didn't forget. They couldn't afford to. And for decades, long after the judges and the accusers were in their own graves, those families kept pushing. They wanted more than an apology. They wanted what was theirs. And that fight, a slow, grinding, bureaucratic fight against the new facts on the ground, is where the story goes next. Because the land grab didn't end with the hangings. It was just getting started. So the court is disbanded. The governor's wife gets named, and suddenly the whole machine grinds to a halt. An apology is issued years too late for the dead. And as we saw, the land deals quietly go through. The pastures change hands. The tavern gets a new owner. The riverfront is parceled out. You might think that's the end of it. The fever breaks, the survivors are released, and everyone tries to forget. That's the comfortable ending, right? A tragic mistake, a collective apology, and a slow, painful healing. But that's not what happened, because an apology is just words, and words don't rebuild a farm. Words don't bring back a herd of cattle. Words don't replant an orchard that's been cut down for firewood by the new owner. The real question, the one that sits there in the silence after the official story ends, is this: what about the stuff? The land, the houses, the animals, the tools, the physical things that made a life possible in 1692. The answer is simple. Most of it was never returned. Think about the process. A woman is accused. She's arrested. From the moment she's taken to the jail in Ipswich or Boston, her property is effectively frozen. She can't work it. She can't sell it. She can't tend to it. But the taxes, those still need to be paid. The colonial government didn't suspend obligations for the accused. So while she's sitting in a cell, eating food she has to pay for, another brutal little detail, prisoners paid for their own upkeep, her farm is falling into disrepair. Weeds are choking the fields. Animals wander off or are taken. Fences collapse. And then, if she's convicted and hanged, the property is officially forfeit. It escheats to the crown or, in practice, to the colonial government. They could seize it, sell it, grant it to someone else. But even if she wasn't convicted, even if she was one of the lucky ones who survived until the panic ended, what was she coming back to? You're a widow. Your husband was pressed to death during questioning. You've been in jail for months. You finally walk free with nothing but the clothes you're wearing and a piece of paper that says you're not a witch. You walk back to your homestead, and there's a family living in it. A family who bought the land at a public auction from the sheriff, or maybe just moved in when it looked abandoned. They've planted your fields with their own seed. They're milking your cow. They look at you like you're a ghost. Because legally, you might be one. Where do you even start? You have no money for a lawyer. The courts that just finished hanging your neighbors are now supposed to help you get your home back. The same judges, the same clerks, the same system. The story goes that some families did try. They petitioned. They pleaded. They presented their cases to the general court in Boston. And here's where it gets weird. The government did eventually pass a bill to reverse the attainders, the legal stains of being a convicted witch. It restored some civil rights. It offered compensation to some of the surviving accused and the families of the dead. But compensation for what? For lost years? For torture? For murder? No, it was compensation for jail fees. That's the part that should bother you. The government agreed to pay back the money that survivors had been forced to spend to cover their own room and board in prison, as if the injustice was an overcharge at an inn. £30 for 9 months of imprisonment while your neighbors plotted to take your land. Here's your change. Sorry for the inconvenience. As for the property itself, that was a different matter. That required a separate, specific legal action. You had to prove title. You had to navigate a maze of deeds and records that may have been lost or altered during your absence. You had to argue against the new owner, who had a bill of sale from the sheriff, who was probably friends with the accuser. You're a known witch, or at least a formerly accused witch, trying to sue an upstanding, church-going pillar of the community who now holds the deed. How many do you think won? The records are patchy. Deliberately so, you have to suspect. But we know of a few cases. The family of George Jacobs S.R., the old man hanged in August, spent years trying to reclaim his substantial farm. It was tied up in courts long after he was dead. Draw your own conclusions about how hard the system worked to give it back. And what about the ones who didn't even try? The ones who were so broken, so terrified that they just left. They vanished into other towns, other colonies, changed their names, and started over with nothing. Their property simply became part of the new landscape. It was absorbed. It normalized. Within a generation, nobody in the village would remember that the nice pasture behind the meeting house once belonged to the widow who cried out to God from the gallows. It was just so-and-so's pasture now. Always had been. That's the real aftermath, not the public weeping and the fast days of repentance, but the quiet, permanent transfer of wealth from one group of families to another. The hysteria provided the smoke. The court provided the fire. And when it was over, some people walked away with ash on their hands, and others walked away with the deeds to the burned-down houses. Now, this is the part nobody talks about. The apologies made it into the history books. The compensation for jail fees got a footnote. But the land, the tangible, fertile, valuable land, that story was buried in county probate records and dusty property disputes. It wasn't a grand narrative of good and evil. It was boring, legalistic, a list of measurements and boundary markers, which is exactly why it's so telling. Because when people want to hide something, they don't put it in a dramatic proclamation. They file it under miscellaneous. So we're left with a village and then a town that physically transformed. The map from before 1692 and the map from after 1700 are different countries. The names on the parcels changed. The centers of power and wealth shifted, permanently, toward the families who had pointed the fingers and away from the families who had felt the rope. And you'd think, centuries later, when historians look back at this foundational American horror story, they'd follow the money all the way to the end. They'd trace every acre. They'd ask, with the cold eye of accountancy, who really paid and who really profited. But most of them didn't. They preferred the simpler story, the one about panic and superstition and mass delusion. A story that lets everyone off the hook, because if everyone was crazy, then nobody was guilty. A story that doesn't require you to look at a property ledger and see a receipt for a human life. But a few people did look, and what they found in those ledgers would force a complete rewrite of the Salem story, a rewrite that the historical establishment has spent decades ignoring. Next time, the historians who ignore the property ledgers. So the trials end. The court is disbanded. The apologies are made, too late and too hollow for the families of the dead. The land, as we've seen, changes hands and stays changed. The story, you'd think, would be over. The fever breaks, the town tries to forget, and history moves on. But history isn't just what happens. It's what gets remembered. And more importantly, how it gets remembered. Who gets to write the story down? What do they choose to emphasize? And what do they quietly, consistently leave out? This is where our story takes a turn from the dusty roads of Salem Village to the hushed halls of academia. Because for 2 centuries after the gallows were taken down, the historians got to work. And they crafted a narrative so clean, so psychological, so conveniently devoid of messy earthly motives that it became the truth. The only truth taught in schools. We've covered the property ledgers, the maps. the deeds that followed the accusations like vultures to a carcass. That evidence didn't vanish. It sat there, in town halls, in private collections, in probate records. It's just that, for generation after generation of scholars, it was uninteresting, inconvenient, or worse, it was vulgar. Think about the story they preferred, the one they still teach. It's a story of mass hysteria, of repressed Puritan sexuality, of adolescent girls having fits. It's a story about belief, about fear, about the supernatural. It's a dark fairy tale with a moral about intolerance. It's tragic, it's dramatic, and crucially, it lets everyone off the hook. No one is greedy in that story. They're just mad. They're not calculating land speculators. They're victims of a collective psychosis. That's a much more palatable history, isn't it? It turns a cold, premeditated crime of property theft into a baffling tragedy of the human mind. It's easier to forgive a frenzy. It's harder to forgive a ledger. So the historians, from the 1700s straight through to the early 1900s, looked at the same documents we've been talking about, and they looked away. They wrote volumes about theology. They psychoanalyzed the accusers. They debated the legal procedures. They wrote long, solemn passages about the dangers of superstition. But the economic records, the patterns of accusation that just happened to follow property lines, the sudden wealth of certain accusers and the total impoverishment of the accused, that was considered beneath the dignity of the subject. It was reducing a profound spiritual crisis to mere materialism. It was, in the words of one early 20th century scholar, a cynical interpretation. And here's the part that should bother you. That word, cynical, it's a shield. It's a way of saying, my interpretation, which ignores land deeds and focuses on ethereal ideas, is more noble, more pure. But is it more true? When you have a map where every hanging coincides with a desirable parcel of land, and you choose to write 10 pages about the demonic temptations of young women instead of one paragraph about that map, what are you doing? You're curating a myth. You're building a cage for the story that makes it safe to discuss. A story about hysterical girls is a cautionary tale. A story about neighbors using the state to murder and steal from neighbors, that's a blueprint. Now, this is the part nobody talks about. This scholarly silence wasn't just an oversight. It was a continuation of the same power dynamic. The people who wrote the first serious histories of New England, they were often descendants of the very establishment that allowed the trials to happen. Or they were academics deeply invested in the idea of America's Puritan founders as stern, flawed, but ultimately noble ideologues, not as grifters in steeple hats. To suggest that the founding generation of a New England town could be motivated by something as base as coveting a better pasture, it undermined a whole origin story. It was easier to blame it on the children, on the unstable, on the emotional climate, anything but the balance sheet. So for 200 years, the standard history texts would mention, in passing, that yes, convicted witches had their property confiscated. It was a footnote, a legal technicality. It was never presented as the engine of the thing. It was a sad side effect. The real cause was always something in the air, something in the water, something in the troubled minds of the villagers. You have to ask yourself, why is a psychological explanation considered deep, while an economic one is considered cynical? Why is mass delusion a more acceptable root cause than organized greed? Is it because one implicates a few bad actors we can lock away in the past, while the other implicates a system of law, of property, of neighbor against neighbor, that never really went away? Stay with me here. Because the shift, when it finally came, didn't come from the history departments at first. It came from the margins. It came from local antiquarians, from genealogists tracing deeds, from independent researchers who weren't afraid of being called cynical. In the 1950s and 60s, as social history began to rise, the history of everyday people, of economics, of class, those dusty property records finally started to get the attention they deserved. Scholars like Chadwick Hansen and, later, Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum didn't just read the sermons from 1692. They read the wills, they plotted the lawsuits, they followed the money. And the pattern that emerged wasn't a cloud of hysteria drifting randomly over the village. It was a targeted strike. It had the precision of a ledger, not the chaos of a nightmare. But even then, the old narrative fought back. It still fights. You'll find textbooks today that spend paragraphs on Tituba's Caribbean folklore and 3 sentences on the fact that Rebecca Nurse's family had to fight for decades to get her meager estate back. The spectral evidence, the ghostly pinches and bites, is discussed as a fascinating legal problem. The sheriff who seized livestock and sold it at auction while the owner was in jail awaiting trial is just a functionary doing his job. That's the real aftermath. It's not just the stolen farms. It's the stolen context. It's the 2-century-long project of taking a raw, brutal story of land hunger and laundering it into a parable about fear. They turned a crime scene into a psychology case study. So when you hear the standard Salem story, the one about the girls and the fits and the oppressive religion, you're hearing the version that the 18th and 19th century historians felt comfortable leaving you. It's the sanitized edition, the one that asks you to marvel at human irrationality, but not to examine human greed. The one that makes you pity the accusers for their delusion, rather than question the beneficiaries of their accusations. They ignored the property ledgers because those ledgers told a simpler, uglier, and far more dangerous story. A story that doesn't end in 1693. A story that says when a community gets scared, the powerful can find a way to direct that fear, to weaponize it, and to make a profit from the wreckage. That's not hysteria. That's a business plan. And the final, quiet insult. The town of Salem today thrives on that sanitized history. The tourism, the witch shops, the Halloween capital of the world shtick, it's all built on the myth of the spooky, hysterical girls. It's not built on the truth of the plundered farms. Because one sells T-shirts and ghost tour. The other demands a different kind of reflection. Which brings us to the ground you're standing on. Literally. Because those farms, those taverns, those riverfront lots, they didn't vanish into thin air. They became something else. The soil soaked with the blood of the condemned ended up supporting new houses, new barns, new families. The map was redrawn, but the earth remained. And if you know where to look, you can still see the shape of the crime in the layout of a modern town, a town built, quite literally, on confiscated soil. So they disbanded the court. They apologized, sort of. They let the remaining accused out of jail if they were still alive to walk out. And the families who lost everything, they never got it back. The land stayed with the new owners, the accusers and their allies, the men who sat on the juries and signed the deeds. The official story was buried and a new one was written. A story of mass hysteria, of superstition, of a tragic but brief fever that broke. A story with no motive and therefore no guilty parties. Just a collective madness that swept through and then receded. But madness doesn't build towns. Greed does. Ambition does. Cold, hard real estate does. You're driving through Danvers, Massachusetts today. It's a quiet, pleasant suburb north of Boston. Nice houses, well-kept lawns. It feels settled, permanent, respectable. What you are driving over, what those houses are built on, is the solved problem of 1692. This town, and much of the land around it, is the physical legacy of the Salem Witch Trials. It is the modern town built on confiscated soil. See, the epicenter wasn't actually Salem town, the busy port. That's where they held the trials and the executions. The accusations, the land grabs, the bitter neighbor disputes, that all festered in Salem Village. A farming community inland, riven with factional strife, jealous of the wealth and political power of the port. After the trials, after the disgrace, the name Salem Village carried a stench. It was synonymous with the whole ugly affair. So in 1752, 60 years after the hangings, the community did something telling. They petitioned to separate from Salem entirely. They wanted a new name, a clean slate. They chose Danvers. A brand new town with a brand new identity, built on the map of the old, troubled village. Now, think about that for a second. You don't rename a place unless you're trying to forget what happened there. You don't incorporate a new town on the same soil unless you want to legally, administratively, bury the past. It's the geographical equivalent of a pardon. By becoming Danvers, the community wasn't just moving on. It was constructing a layer of bureaucratic dirt over the unmarked graves of its own history. The land titles, the property lines, the very charter of the town, all of it now belonged to a new entity, one with no legal connection to the confiscations of 1692. The paper trail, already murky, was officially terminated. And what happened to the physical evidence? The homes of the accused? Here's where it gets quiet, deliberately quiet. The houses of the convicted were often dismantled. Not always, but often. Their timber was repurposed. Their stone foundations were sometimes buried or scattered. In a few cases, the houses were simply taken over by the new owners, the accusers or their families, and absorbed into other properties. The goal was erasure. A witch's dwelling was considered contaminated, haunted by their spectral presence. But more practically, it was a monument to an injustice that had to be forgotten for the new order to feel legitimate. You can't have the widow of the man you hanged for her riverfront farm, living next door in her old house. And you certainly can't have her children pointing at it, saying, "That was ours." So the houses vanished. The fields were plowed under new names. The pastures were fenced by new hands. You walk through some of the older parts of Danvers or the surrounding towns like Andover or Topsfield, and you might find a historical marker. It will say something like, "Site of the homestead of," and it will name someone accused. But there's rarely a house there. Sometimes there's just a field. Sometimes there's a house from the 1700s or 1800s, built long after, its cellar hole dug into earth that had already been settled. The marker is a whisper. The absence of the house is the real story. The modern landscape is a palimpsest, a document where the old writing has been scraped away to make room for the new. But you can still see the ghosts of the letters underneath, if you know how to look. That oddly angled stone wall in the middle of a woodlot, that might be the boundary of John Proctor's farm, land that was seized and later sold off in parcels. That ancient, gnarled apple tree in a suburban backyard. It might be a descendant of an orchard planted by a woman who was hanged before she could harvest the fruit. The town of Danvers is a successful cover-up. It worked. For centuries, the dominant historical narrative treated the trials as a psychological or theological event, a bizarre outbreak of panic. Textbooks talked about ergot poisoning, about repressed sexual hysteria, about Puritan fear. They almost never talked about deeds. They almost never superimposed the map of accusations over the map of property disputes. Because if you do that, the story stops being about ghosts and starts being about greed. And that's a much harder story for a town or a nation to tell about its founding. The roads themselves often tell the truth. Many of the older lanes in the area follow the original property lines from the 1600s. Those lines were drawn by the men who ended up with the land. So when you drive down a quiet street in Danvers, you are quite literally traveling the borders of the spoils. The asphalt is the seal on the deal. And what about the descendants? The families of the accused who were driven out, impoverished, their names ruined. They scattered. Some went north into New Hampshire or Maine. Some went west. They carried the stigma with them, a family secret of grandmother who was hanged as a witch or a grandfather who died in jail awaiting trial. For generations, it wasn't something you advertised. Meanwhile, the families of the accusers, the Putnams and others remained. They became pillars of the new community of Danvers. They held local offices. They donated to churches. They wrote the first local histories, which, not surprisingly, soft-pedaled their ancestors' roles and emphasized the general confusion of the times. History is written by the winners, but in this case, it's also lived on by them. The winners built the libraries that hold the sanitized histories. They funded the historical societies that placed the vague markers. They became, in essence, the custodians of the very narrative that absolved them. Walk through the old cemeteries in Danvers. You'll find grand monuments to Putnam descendants, to judges and merchants and deacons. The stones are tall, the inscriptions long. They speak of legacy, of honor, of continuity. Now try to find the grave of Giles Corey, pressed to death for refusing to plead so his sons could still inherit his farm. He's not there. He's in an unmarked grave on Gallows Hill in Salem. Try to find the grave of Rebecca Nurse, hanged at 71. Her family secretly retrieved her body and buried it on their original homestead land they no longer owned. It was a clandestine act of reclamation, a tiny, defiant seed of memory planted in stolen soil. Her simple grave is there, but it's not in the orderly rows of the Danvers cemeteries. It's apart. It's an anomaly. That's the visual grammar of the cover-up. The architects of the tragedy are in the center of town, under carved marble. The victims are buried at the margins, if they're buried at all. So when you visit today, you're not really visiting the site of the Salem Witch Trials. You're visiting the monument to their aftermath. You're walking through the world that was made possible by them. The neat houses, the quiet streets, the sense of New England order, all of it rests on a foundation of terror, theft, and a brilliantly executed campaign of forgetting. They didn't just take the land, they took the story. They built a town on the first, and they wrote a history to justify the second. But words have meanings that shift over time. And to really understand the engine of 1692, you have to ask a much simpler, darker question. When they called a woman a witch, what were they actually accusing her of? What did that word mean in that place, at that desperate moment? Because it wasn't about broomsticks. It was about something far more dangerous to the men who were drawing up the new property maps. Now we come to the part of the story where the past gets buried. Not with shovels, but with words. The official record, the history books, the legacy. This is where the story of Salem gets smoothed over, sanded down, and turned into a parable about superstition and mass hysteria. A cautionary tale about fear. And that's not wrong exactly. But it's not the whole truth, and you have to ask yourself, why is the whole truth so hard to find? After the court was disbanded, after the apologies were made, too late for the hanged, there was a long, quiet period of reckoning. Or rather, a long, quiet period of not reckoning. The colony wanted to move on. The families of the accused wanted their names cleared and, more pressingly, their property returned. The new government, under a new charter from England, wanted stability. These desires were in direct conflict. So what do? You create a narrative. You decide what witch meant in 1692 because the definition you settle on determines who is guilty of what and what is owed to whom. If a witch was a servant of Satan, a genuine supernatural threat to the community, then seizing her property was a defensive act. A necessary forfeiture. The land was tainted, purified by its transfer to more godly hands. But if a witch was just a neighbor with a temper and a good parcel of land, well, that's something else entirely. That's fraud. That's theft, that's murder. The authorities chose the first definition. They had to. To admit the second would have unraveled the entire social and economic order they just violently reshuffled. So the official story became one of a tragic error. Good, God-fearing people were tragically misled by spectral evidence. The devil tricked them. The girls were hysterical. The judges were overzealous. It was a perfect storm of fear. Notice what's missing from that story: the deeds, the titles, the maps, the transfers of acreage that happened after the gallows stopped swinging. The word witch became a container. You could pour all the colony's anxieties into it: fear of the wilderness, fear of Indian attacks, religious paranoia, teenage rebellion. And that's the container that got passed down for centuries. Historians looked into that container and saw those things. They saw psychology, they saw theology, they saw gender studies, and all of that is in there, it's real. But they rarely, if ever, tipped the container over to see what was stuck to the bottom. The dirt, the soil. The literal ground upon which the drama played out. You know, if you're still listening at this point, you're one of us. Hit subscribe. We uncover a new American mystery every single night. This is how history gets written. The messy material motives, greed, envy, a desire for that pasture, that orchard, that tavern license are translated into cleaner, more abstract language. It's not a land grab, it's a social conflict. It's not a property dispute, it's a clash of worldviews. The economic engine of the trials is acknowledged, sometimes in a footnote. But it's never put center stage. It's never treated as the main plot. Because if it was the main plot, then Salem isn't a spooky story about ghosts and witches. It's a cold, premeditated story about murder and theft under color of law. And which story is easier to teach in school? Which story feels more like an ancient, superstitious tragedy, and which one feels like a blueprint that could be used again? So the record was set. The narrative hardened. By the 19th century, Salem was a romantic Gothic tragedy. Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose own ancestor was one of the hanging judges, wrestled with the guilt in his stories, but he wrestled with it as a moral and spiritual stain. The property, the wealth that might have flowed down through his own family from those judgments, that wasn't part of the romantic gloom. It was just history. The victims were memorialized as martyrs to superstition, not as holders of titles that were illegally seized. And this is the legacy that gets buried the deepest, the quiet, ongoing consequence. Those land deals we talked about, they weren't reversed. The families that petitioned for years, decades sometimes, to get their farms back, most of them never did. The new owners held them. They built on them. They passed them to their children. The town of Salem, and the towns that grew out of it, literally expanded onto this confiscated soil. The modern landscape is built on a foundation of legalized theft. We walk over it every day. We just call it real estate. Think about that for a second. The most infamous witch hunt in history, a story known around the world, is almost never discussed as a case study in eminent domain run amok. As a warning about what happens when you combine a legal mechanism with a manufactured panic. They teach you about the spectral evidence. They teach you about the oppressive Puritan society. They don't teach you to read a property ledger alongside a trial transcript. Because if you do that, the story changes. It becomes less about what people believed and more about what people stood to gain. It becomes practical. And a practical evil is far more dangerous than a supernatural one because it doesn't require you to believe in the devil. It just requires you to want what your neighbor has. Now, here's the part that should bother you. This legacy of erasure isn't passive. It's active. When you go to Salem today, what do you see? Witch shops, ghost tour, Halloween attractions. The tourism industry runs on the supernatural interpretation, the spooky story. It commodifies the very hysteria that was the cover story. It's profitable to keep the story in the realm of the occult. It's not profitable. In fact, it's deeply uncomfortable to have plaques that say, "On this spot stood the farm of Bridget Bishop, seized by the court and sold at auction to her accuser's cousin." One is a fun, scary story. The other is an accusation that echoes down the centuries. The memorials that do exist, the somber ones with the stone benches, they speak of injustice and tragedy. They name the dead. And that is vital, it's honorable. But they don't name the living who benefited. They don't diagram the transactions. The material truth of Salem remains subsurface, like a buried water table, while the spectral story flows freely down the main streets. We've chosen to remember the cover story, not the crime. So what did witch really mean in 1692? In the courtroom, it meant a heretic. In the streets, it meant a target. On the deed, it meant vacant. It was the ultimate branding iron. It turned a person into a concept, and then it turned their life's work into vacant land, ready for the taking. The word itself was the tool that made the theft not just possible, but righteous. And that meaning, that specific, practical, devastating meaning, has been almost completely written out of the popular history. We're left with the shadows and ignored the shape of the thing casting them. We've buried the body but kept the ghost. And a ghost can't sign a deed. A ghost can't reclaim a farm. A ghost is just a story you tell in the dark. Which brings us to the final, lingering question. If we've so thoroughly misunderstood, or perhaps avoided, the real mechanics of Salem, what other stories are we telling wrong? What other ghosts are we entertaining to avoid looking at the much more solid, much more troubling bodies in the ground? Tomorrow night's story is one they really don't want you to hear. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The panic ended because it threatened the powerful. The story was softened because the truth threatened the legacy. But the land is still there, and it holds on to its secrets, waiting for someone to read the map instead of the legend. The ghost of a more practical explanation has been whispering from the soil for over 300 years. Maybe it's time we finally listened. So here we are. The last of the accused are released from jail, the governor's wife is safe, the court is disbanded, the apologies are made. The land, of course, stays exactly where it was transferred, to new owners. The story, as far as the official record is concerned, is over. It's a tragedy, a bout of mass hysteria, a cautionary tale about superstition and fear. They close the book. They bury it. But you don't just bury 19 bodies and a few dozen shattered lives. You bury the motive. You bury the paperwork. You bury the quiet, practical reasons in favor of the loud, supernatural ones. Because one story makes you question human nature, the other makes you question property law. And that's the ghost that haunts Salem long after the last so-called witch was in the ground. Not the specter of Bridget Bishop or George Burroughs, the ghost of a more practical explanation. A stubborn, silent phantom of greed and opportunity that nobody in the centuries after wanted to acknowledge because it was far uglier than specters. It was mundane. It was real estate. Think about how the story gets cleaned up for history. The 18th century rolls around. Salem is trying to be respectable. It's a prosperous port. The last thing you want is to be known as that town where neighbors cannibalized each other over pasture land. So the narrative hardens. It becomes a story about psychology, about adolescent girls, about religious fanaticism. Cotton Mather, one of the chief architects of the witch hunt theology, gets to write his own version of events. He downplays his role, emphasizes the devil's cunning, and frames it all as a terrible but spiritually understandable mistake. The land transfers, the contested wills, the sudden wealth of the accusers' families, footnotes, if they're mentioned at all. By the 19th century, the Romantics get hold of it. Now it's a Gothic romance. It's about dark forests and superstition and the haunting of America by old-world fears. Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose own ancestor was a hanging judge in the trials, writes The House of the Seven Gables, a novel literally about a cursed house built on stolen land. He allegorizes it. He makes it about guilt and ancestry. But he doesn't write a pamphlet called The Deeds of the 7 Acres. The actual physical theft gets lost in the atmospheric haze. And that's how it works, isn't it? The strange and spectral is always a better story than the ledger and the lawsuit. A ghost is a mystery. A property dispute is just paperwork. Which one would you rather believe your town was founded on? So the practical explanation goes into the attic. It gathers dust. When historians do look at the economic angle in the 20th century, it's often framed as a factor, one of many, a contributing element to the social stress, not the engine. Never the engine. To suggest it was the engine is reductive. It's cynical. It implies our forebears weren't just tragically mistaken, but calculating. And we've decided as a culture that calculation is a worse sin than murder by superstition. At least the latter has drama. The former is just cold. But stay with me here. Let's talk about what this burial costs us. When you bury the land grab thesis, you do something very specific to the victims. You strip them of their full humanity. You make them into symbols, the innocent, the martyred, the persecuted. And they were. But they were also people with assets. Rebecca Nurse was a pious woman, yes. She was also a woman with a prosperous homestead that her family fought to keep. Giles Corey was a stubborn old man who refused to plead, yes. He was also a man who, by refusing to plead, ensured his estate would pass to his heirs and not be confiscated by the court. His famous last words, "More weight," aren't just a cry of defiance against tyranny. They're a last, brutal act of estate planning. When we forget that, we make them two-dimensional. We remove their agency, their savvy, their connection to the dirt they owned and worked. We turn them into passive recipients of fate, rather than active players in a brutal economic and legal system that turned on them. That should bother you. The sanitized version is, in its own way, just as disrespectful. And what about the accusers? The narrative that focuses solely on the hysteria of the girls lets everyone else off the hook. The fathers, the uncles, the magistrates and constables and neighbors who didn't have fits, but who did very well when the accusations started flying next to their property lines. The Putnams don't get analyzed as a family with a history of land disputes and a shrinking inheritance for too many sons. They become the unfortunate parents of a bewitched child. The story of Ann Putnam Jr.'s trauma is real, but it's also a very useful story for her family. It always was. This is the legacy of the burial. We get a national parable about the dangers of intolerance. And that's a good lesson, a vital one. But we miss the older, darker, more persistent lesson, how easily the machinery of fear can be greased by envy. How the language of the supernatural, of demons and specters and unseen evil, can be the perfect smoke screen for the very seen, very tangible evil of theft. How a community can convince itself it's saving its soul, while it's really just consolidating its wealth. The ghost of the practical explanation doesn't rattle chains in the night. It whispers in the archives. It's in the dry, brittle pages of probate records where a farm changes hands 3 months after its owner is hanged. It's in the will that is suddenly challenged by a new witness who saw the testator acting strangely. It's in the map we looked at earlier, where the accusations cluster along property lines like mold on damp wood. We dug it up tonight, we looked at it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. It changes the color of the entire story. The panic wasn't a wildfire that spread randomly. It was a controlled burn, and some people were holding the torches not to purge the community but to clear the land. So what's left unresolved? Everything that matters. The full, unvarnished story of who gained what and how precisely they orchestrated it is still scattered. It's in those ignored ledgers. It's in the family histories that were rewritten. It's in the uncomfortable silence that still hangs over the town when you ask, not about witches, but about deeds. The historical record is a palimpsest, a document where the original writing has been scraped away to make room for a new, cleaner text. But if you hold it to the light at the right angle, you can still see the old words underneath. The words about fences, and water rights, and acreage. We're left with a choice. We can accept the haunted version, the one with the shrieking girls and the invisible world. It's a good story. Or we can acknowledge the ghost of the other one, the quiet, chillingly rational explanation that was buried because it was too shameful, too damning, too real. But here's the final question, the one that leads us out of the past and right into the present. If the land grab explanation is so obvious once you look at the maps and the deeds, why has the fairy tale version survived for over 300 years? Who does that story serve? Think about that. Because the answer tells you less about 1692 and more about every story we've ever chosen to believe since. So here we are, the last page of the ledger, the final section. We've walked through the panic, the accusations, the gallows, and the quiet, efficient transfer of deeds that followed. We've seen the map. You know the names, the farms, the riverfront plots that changed hands not by sale, but by sentence. But now we have to ask the hardest question, not what happened, but why we've been so determined for over 300 years to forget the why. Why does the fairy tale version survive? Think about the story you learned if you learned it at all. Troubled girls, bizarre fits. A superstitious town gripped by a madness we modern people can barely comprehend. It's a morality play about mass hysteria, a warning about the dangers of religious extremism and false accusations. It's neat. It's psychological. It lets everyone off the hook because madness isn't anyone's fault. It's a force of nature, like a storm, and that's so much easier to live with. Because if it was just a storm of hysteria, then the soil of Salem Village isn't stained with anything more than tragedy. It's hallowed ground for a cautionary tale, You can build a museum on it. You can sell t-shirts. You can point to it and say, "Look how far we've come from those dark, ignorant days." But if you introduce the land, if you introduce the deeds, the wills, the pastures and orchards that wound up in the accusers' families, the story gets messy. It gets criminal. It becomes about greed, not ghosts. About a very old, very human sin, using the machinery of fear to dispossess your neighbor. And that story doesn't end in 1692. That story is uncomfortable. It echoes. It asks us to look at other moments of public panic and wonder what was being bought and sold while everyone was looking at the specters. So the fairy tale survives because it's safer. The historians who focused solely on the psychology, who pored over the trial transcripts about the devil's touch but never cross-referenced the property records, they weren't necessarily dishonest. They were just building a cage around the story that made it a relic, a strange artifact from our primitive past. You can study a relic. You don't have to live with its consequences. Look at the town today. Danvers, Massachusetts. It's quiet, suburban. The past is packaged. There's a memorial. There are historical markers. The soil we talked about, the confiscated soil, is underneath driveways and backyards and school playgrounds. The roots of those old orchards are long gone, replaced by sewer lines and fiber optic cables. The physical legacy is buried, literally. But the other legacy, the legal and moral one, that's where it gets interesting. And where the fairy tale does its most important work. The official reversal came, as we know, too late for the hanged. The apologies were made. The attainders were lifted for some families. But here's the part that should bother you. The restitution for stolen property was a fraction of what was taken. Some families never got a shilling. The legal mechanism for returning a farm after the accuser's son had been working it for 5 years was complicated, deliberately so. The story became about saving souls posthumously, not about restoring estates. So we remember the spectral evidence being outlawed. We remember the court being discredited. We frame it as a triumph of reason over superstition. And that's true as far as it goes. But it's also a magnificent diversion. It lets the real crime, the theft, fade into a bureaucratic footnote. Oh, the property stuff was all sorted out later, the fairy tale implies. It was. Now this is the part nobody talks about. The silence of the descendants. You have to wonder about them. The great-great-great-grandchildren of the accusers, living in New England with that name in the family Bible. And the descendants of the accused, who might not even know their connection to a woman hanged as a witch. What do you do with that? Do you lean into the fairy tale? My ancestor was caught up in a terrible tragedy. Or do you open the land records and face a colder possibility? And what about the descendants of the Putnams, the most prolific accusers, whose family fortunes solidified in the wake of the trials? The story goes that some of them, generations later, became ardent abolitionists. Atonement through a new cause. Or just the way history layers itself, one moral certainty over the bones of an older, forgotten sin. Nobody confirmed this, but you draw your own conclusions. The fairy tale also allows us to separate ourselves completely. We would never fall for spectral evidence. We are rational, but replace spectral evidence with the right kind of fear, a fear of infiltration, of corruption, of the enemy within, and the mechanism is identical. You dehumanize, you legitimize the seizure of assets, you create a legal framework for it. The panic in 1692 wasn't about witchcraft. It was about a threat to the social and economic order. The witch was just the container they put that fear in. We still have containers. So we keep the fairy tale alive because it inoculates us. It lets us believe the disease was one particular superstition, cured by the Enlightenment. It was. The disease was opportunism. The cure is a lot harder to come by. What remains unresolved today? Almost everything that matters. The full, unredacted property transfers. The complete financial relationships between the judges, the accusers, and the sheriffs who seized the assets. We have fragments, glimpses. Enough to see the pattern, but the official records, the ones that would lay it bare in dry, administrative language, those are the ghosts that truly haunt this story. The missing documents. We have the confession of a town's hysteria. We do not have the balance sheet of its profit. And that's why, when you visit Salem now, you feel the disconnect. The commercial Halloween spectacle sits uneasily beside the somber memorial. The real horror isn't in the plastic cauldrons and witch hats. It's in the quiet, ordinary landscape. It's in the fact that the most plausible explanation, a land grab disguised as a witch hunt, is still, in many mainstream tellings, treated as a fringe theory. An asterisk. The fairy tale survives because it's a better story for tourism, and a less painful one for the conscience of a nation built on taken things. In the end, they memorialized the victims. They built a monument with stone benches for each person hanged. They carved their protests of innocence into the granite. It's moving. It's right. But you won't find a monument listing the acres stolen. You won't find a stone bench for the orchard that was lost, or the tavern that changed hands, or the fairy rites that were quietly absorbed by a rival. The economic violence is erased, leaving only the spiritual tragedy. We forgive the first kind more easily than the second. We understand panic. We have a harder time with premeditated greed wearing a mask of godly fear. That mask is the real American mystery here, not the witchcraft. The alchemy that turns fear into capital and then convinces everyone, centuries later, that it was all just a bad dream. That's the story, or at least, that's the version that survived. The last plot of confiscated land was never returned to the heir who petitioned for it. Pause. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person this channel was made for. We go deep on a different American mystery every night. Subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow. And hey, tell me in the comments, if you were a descendant of an accuser, would you want to know what your family gained in 1692? I want to hear your theory. Sleep well.